Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. And I'd never heard a forest go so silent. It was as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. That's when I first realized I wasn't alone. I've hiked countless trails across the country, from the Appalachian to the Cascades. After a while, you get used to the solitude. It becomes comforting. The silence of the woods, the steady rhythm of your own feet hitting the dirt. It's meditative. That's why, when I took off on the Lone Pine Trail in Sierra Nevada, I wasn't worried. I knew the route, and I had my gear. I was planning a solo trip for a few days, just me and the wilderness. The first day was perfect. The sky was cloudless, the air crisp and cool. Birds chirped and the occasional scuttle of small animals brought the forest to life. It was quiet, but in that peaceful way, like nature's soundtrack humming in the background. I set up camp by a creek just before dusk, the sound of running water filling the space around me. It was around then that the forest started to feel different. I noticed it while I was sitting by the fire, cooking some freeze-dried food. The usual sounds, the birds, the rustling in the bushes, the wind weaving through the leaves, all of it just stopped. I'm used to quiet moments in the woods, but this felt wrong. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was tense, like something was off, and everything around me knew it. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just overthinking it. I had been out here enough times to know that forests had their moods, right? The fire crackled, the stars began to pop out, and I figured I was just being paranoid. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I decided to turn in early. The plan was to head deeper into the mountains the next day, and I needed to be rested. But as I lay in my tent, listening, the silence felt suffocating. I kept waking up, convinced I'd heard something outside. Every time I'd hold my breath, straining to hear nothing, just that oppressive, unnatural silence. The second day was better, or so I thought. I packed up camp, ready to shake off the weirdness from the night before. The morning was clear, the air crisp. I felt more like myself as I started my hike up into the higher elevations, but as the day wore on, that feeling of being watched crept back. I'd stop every now and then, turning around, scanning the trees behind me. No one was there, of course not. I was miles away from any other hikers. I'd made sure of that. Around midday, I found a small clearing and took a break, sitting on a rock to eat. That's when I saw them, the first set of prints. At first glance, they seemed like bear tracks, but they were different, larger, wider. The toes looked wrong too, more like fingers than paws. I knelt down to get a better look, but the ground was too hard to make out much detail. I couldn't be sure what had made them, but I felt that cold prickle of fear creeping up the back of my neck. I wasn't alone out here. Something had been nearby, and it was big. I tried to push the thought away. There were animals in these woods, plenty of them. I'd seen elk, black bears, even mountain lions in my travels. This was their home, after all. But none of those animals left prints like the ones I'd seen. By the time dusk started to settle in, I found a good spot to camp for the night. A small, sheltered area surrounded by tall pines. As I set up my tent, the unease from the day gnawed at me. But I kept telling myself I was being ridiculous. What was I scared of? A set of weird footprints. I'd been out here dozens of times and never had a problem. But then, just as I was finishing up my campfire, I heard it, a snap, a crackle, the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the woods, not far from where I stood. I froze, listening. My heart pounded in my ears. The sound came again. Closer this time. Whatever it wasn't trying to be quiet. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the trees, but the light only made the shadows deeper, more menacing. Nothing moved, no eyes reflecting back at me, no sudden rustle of leaves. But I knew something was there. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. It felt like the forest was holding its breath again, waiting for something. For what? I didn't want to find out. I quickly doused the fire, leaving the embers to smolder as I crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight. I lay there in the dark, my flashlight clutched in my hand. Outside, the silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the rustling of leaves. My heart raced as my mind replayed the sound over and over. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal passing through, but deep down I didn't believe it. And then the footsteps started. They were slow at first, almost hesitant, but heavy, too heavy. Something was moving outside my tent, circling it. I could hear the soft crunch of dirt underfoot, the deliberate sound of something large shifting its weight. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to listen, barely daring to move. The steps stopped right outside my tent. I was paralyzed. My hand gripped the flashlight so tight it hurt. I wanted to turn it on, shine the light at whatever was out there, but I couldn't. I was too afraid of what I might see. Instead, I lay there, perfectly still, listening to the sound of my own breathing, waiting for the next move. Minutes passed. The air was thick with tension. I could feel it, a presence just beyond the thin layer of fabric that separated me from the night. It was watching me. I knew it. And then, slowly, the footsteps started again, moving away this time. Whatever it was leaving. The relief was immediate, but I didn't dare move. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, listening as the sounds of the forest slowly returned. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. When I finally fell asleep, it was out of sheer exhaustion, my body too tired to keep up the fear any longer. The next morning, I was up before dawn, packing my gear with shaky hands. I had no intention of sticking around to see what might come back that night. As I gathered my things, I glanced around the campsite, searching for any sign of what had been out there. That's when I saw them, the prints. They were clearer now in the soft morning light, pressed deep into the dirt around my tent, huge, human-like prints, but far too large to belong to any man. They circled my campsite, coming within feet of my tent, before disappearing back into the trees. I felt my stomach twist. Whatever had been out there, it wasn't a bear, it wasn't any animal I knew of. And it had been watching me, circling me, deciding whether or not I was a threat, or worse, prey. I didn't waste any more time. I shouldered my pack and started down the trail, moving as quickly as I could. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence that had once comforted me now felt like a trap. The trees felt like they were closing in, hiding something just out of sight. It wasn't until I was miles down the trail, back in the lower elevations, that I finally felt like I could breathe again. The sounds of the forest had returned, birds chirping, the wind in the trees. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. By the time I reached my car, my legs were trembling with exhaustion, my mind racing. I threw my pack in the back seat and peeled out of the parking lot, the road stretching out ahead of me like a lifeline. I haven't been back to the Lone Pine Trail since. I'm not sure I ever will. Whatever was out there that night, it was real, and it was watching me. And maybe, just maybe, it's still out there, waiting for someone else to come too close. Story 2. I never should have taken that night shift alone. But I was the new ranger, eager to prove myself. How could I have known that the darkness held more than just shadows? It was supposed to be a routine patrol. Just me, Sarah Jensen, 23 years old and fresh out of training, doing my first solo night shift at Blackwood National Forest. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and decaying leaves. I'd been on the job for barely 2 months, but I felt ready, confident, maybe a little too confident. The sun had set hours ago, leaving only a sliver of moon to illuminate the forest. My flashlight cut a narrow beam through the darkness as I made my way along the main trail. The beam caught the reflective eyes of small animals, raccoons, opossums, the occasional fox. Normal forest dwellers. Nothing to be concerned about. I paused at a trail junction, consulting my map. The faint crackle of my radio was a comfort, a tenuous link to civilization. I decided to check the remote campgrounds, making sure no hikers were breaking curfew or starting unauthorized fires. That's when I heard it. A branch snapping, loud enough to cut through the ambient forest sounds. I swung my flashlight toward the noise, heart quickening. Nothing but trees and underbrush. Probably just a deer, I told myself, but something felt off. I resumed walking, my senses on high alert. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees looming taller, their shadows deeper and more menacing. I quickened my pace, leaves crunching underfoot. Another snap, closer this time. I spun around, fumbling for my bear spray. The beam of my flashlight trembled, revealing nothing but dancing shadows. A bead of cold sweat trickled down my spine. "Hello?" I called out, cursing the quaver in my voice. "This is Ranger Jensen. Is anyone there?" Silence. Just the whisper of wind through the trees and my own ragged breathing. I reached for my radio, desperate for human contact. "Base! This is Jensen. I'm at—" I squinted at my GPS unit. Grid coordinates 37 to 42. I think there might be static. Nothing but harsh, grating static filled the air. I jiggled the radio, heart pounding. "Base, do you copy? Over." More static. Then faintly, I heard something. Not over the radio, but in the forest behind me. A low, rumbling growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I ran. Branches whipped at my face as I tore down the trail, abandoning all pretense of calm. Something was behind me. Something big. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush, gaining ground with each passing second. My lungs burned as I sprinted, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately regretted it. 2 pinpricks of reflected light set high off the ground. Eyes. Whatever was chasing me was massive. I veered off the main trail, hoping to lose it in the denser forest. My boot caught on an exposed root, sending me sprawling. I hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of me. My flashlight went flying, its beam cutting crazily through the trees before going dark. For a moment, I lay there, gasping for air, ears straining for any sound of pursuit. Nothing. Had I lost it? Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself to my feet. Everything hurt. I fumbled in the darkness, searching for my flashlight. My hand closed around the familiar cylinder, but when I clicked the switch, nothing. Either the impact had broken it, or the batteries had come loose. I was alone in the pitch-black forest, without light, without communication, and something was out there, fighting down panic. I tried to orient myself. The moon had vanished behind heavy clouds, leaving me with no visual reference. I closed my eyes, focusing on my other senses. The wind was coming from my left. That meant north. The ranger station was east, or was it southeast? A twig snapped nearby. My eyes flew open, though it made little difference in the inky blackness. I held my breath, listening intently. Another snap, closer this time, then a low, huffing sound, like something big, smelling the air. It was toying with me. I backed away slowly, hands outstretched to feel for trees. My foot came down on something that rolled, a fallen branch. I bent down, fingers closing around the rough bark. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. The huffing grew louder, closer. I could smell it now, a rank, musky odor that made my stomach churn. My back pressed against a tree trunk, nowhere left to run. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice cracking. I swung the branch wildly in front of me. "I'm warning you!" A low growl was the only response. Then silence, complete, oppressive silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity. Something brushed against my leg. I screamed, swinging the branch with all my might. It connected with something solid, eliciting a surprised yelp. Not human, not bear, something else. Adrenaline surged through me. I pushed off from the tree, running blindly through the forest. Branches tore at my clothes and skin, but I didn't care. All that mattered was putting distance between me and that thing. I don't know how long I ran. Minutes, hours, time lost all meaning in the darkness. Eventually, my legs gave out, and I collapsed to the forest floor, lungs heaving. I lay there, ears straining for any sound of pursuit. Nothing, just the normal sounds of the nighttime forest. As my breathing slowed, reason began to reassert itself. I needed to find my way back to the ranger station. But how? I had no idea where I was. No light, no compass. My radio was still silent. I pushed myself to my feet, wincing at the various aches and pains making themselves known. Think, Sarah, what did they teach you in training? Stay put. That was the first rule when lost in the wilderness. But staying put meant whatever that thing was might find me again. I shuddered at the thought. Find water. Water usually led to civilization. I stood still, listening intently. There, the faint sound of running water to my right. A stream, maybe. I moved cautiously in that direction, hands outstretched to feel for obstacles. The sound grew louder, and soon I felt the ground sloping downward. My boots splashed in shallow water. I knelt, cupping my hands to drink. The cold water was a blessed relief for my parched throat. As I drank, my mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. What was that thing in the forest? It moved like no animal I'd ever encountered, and the way it had stalked me, almost playfully. A splash downstream made me freeze. I held my breath, listening. Another splash, closer this time. Something was moving through the water, heading my way. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding. Not again. I couldn't go through that terror again. I turned to run, but my foot slipped on a wet rock. I went down hard, my head striking something solid. Pain exploded through my skull. I tasted blood. The world spun, and darkness began to creep in at the edges of my vision. No, I thought desperately, have to stay awake. Have to... The last thing I heard before losing consciousness was the sound of heavy footsteps approaching through the water. I awoke to the sound of voices and the painful glare of flashlights. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. Then the pain hit, my head throbbing, every muscle in my body aching. Jensen, can you hear me? A familiar voice. Roberts, the senior ranger. I tried to speak but only managed a groan. Hands gently rolled me onto my back. I squinted against the light, making out concerned faces hovering over me. Thank God, Roberts said. We've been searching for hours. What happened? I opened my mouth to explain, then hesitated. How could I possibly describe what I'd experienced? They'd think I was crazy. Hell, maybe I was crazy. I got lost, I managed to croak. Fell and hit my head. Roberts nodded, though I could see the doubt in his eyes. Let's get you back to base. The medic needs to take a look at that bump on your head. As they helped me to my feet, I glanced around. We were indeed by a small stream, but something caught my eye. There, in the mud at the water's edge, a footprint, massive, with clear claw marks at the tips of the toes, not human, not bare. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone, washed away by the flowing water, or perhaps never there at all. You okay, Jensen? Roberts asked, noting my distraction. I nodded slowly. Yeah, just glad to be found. As they led me back through the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold secrets, every rustle in the undergrowth a potential threat. I told myself it was just nerves, the lingering effects of my ordeal, but deep down I knew the truth. Something was out there in the darkness, something that didn't belong, and sooner or later I'd have to face it again. For now, though, I was safe. The warm lights of the ranger station beckoned, promising security and answers. But as I glanced back at the deep shadows of Blackwood Forest, I knew one thing for certain: I would never look at the wilderness the same way again. Story 3. The trees around me creaked and groaned in the wind, but something else was out there. I could feel it, watching, waiting, and no amount of training could prepare me for what I was about to face. I always thought I knew the forest better than most people. I grew up near it, worked in it for years as a ranger, and knew every tree, every rock, and every trail like the back of my hand. You spend enough time in the wilderness, you learn to read it, you learn its rhythms, its sounds, its silences. That's why, when I took over the night patrols in that remote stretch of Michigan forest, I didn't feel nervous. If anything, it was the kind of peace I craved. No tourists, no distractions. Just me in the woods. The first few nights were uneventful, boring even. My job was simple: make sure the trails were clear, check for signs of illegal hunting, and ensure no campers were where they weren't supposed to be. I'd drive out in my old truck, park at a trailhead, and walk a couple of miles with a flashlight and my radio, my only company being the occasional rustle of a deer or the hoot of an owl. But on the fourth night, things started to feel different. I had just parked at one of the more isolated trailheads, one that led deep into a part of the forest few people bothered to visit. It was colder than usual, the air thick with moisture that clung to my skin. The moon was hidden behind a layer of thick clouds, and the wind whistled through the trees in a way that felt more like a warning than anything else. As I started down the trail, I noticed it was quieter than normal. Too quiet, the kind of quiet where the usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of insects, the scurrying of small animals, just weren't there. I could hear the crunch of my boots on the dirt, the rustle of my jacket as I moved, but nothing else. Not a single sound. At first, I tried to ignore it. I've been through this forest in every season, in every kind of weather, and sometimes nature just goes still. Maybe a predator was nearby, or maybe the wind had shifted in just the right way to silence the usual chorus of life. But after about a mile in, I felt it, the sensation of being watched. Now, I know what you're thinking. I'm a ranger. I'm supposed to be used to this kind of thing, and I am. I've had run-ins with black bears, coyotes, even a mountain lion once. But this was different. This wasn't the primal awareness of another animal's presence. This was something else, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I stopped walking and stood still, listening. The wind had died down. The trees no longer groaned or creaked. There was only the sound of my own breathing, the quiet hiss of air leaving my lungs in short bursts. I scanned the forest around me with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness in sharp slices, but all I saw were trees and shadows, the light bouncing off trunks and branches in the distance. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards ahead of me, just at the edge of my flashlight's range, there was a large, dark shape. I couldn't make out what it was. It could have been a fallen log, or maybe just an unusually large bush. But something about it didn't sit right with me. It wasn't moving, but it wasn't entirely still either. It was like the air around it was shifting, bending ever so slightly. I took a step forward, trying to get a better look, but as soon as I did, the shape disappeared. Just gone, as if it had never been there. My stomach tightened. I wasn't about to run back to my truck like some rookie, but my instincts were telling me something was off. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I wasn't alone out here, and whatever was out there wasn't friendly. I continued on, more cautious now, keeping my flashlight scanning in wide arcs as I walked. Every few minutes, I'd stop, listen, and wait. The feeling of being watched never went away. If anything, it got worse. I could feel eyes on me, tracking me through the trees, staying just out of sight. After another mile, I came across something I hadn't expected to see. A dead deer. It was fresh, the body still warm, steam rising from its exposed flesh in the cold night air. But this wasn't a normal kill. Its body had been torn open, gutted, with chunks of flesh missing in a way that was too precise to be a bear or a wolf. The cuts were deep, jagged, as if something had ripped into it with incredible force. I crouched down, shining my light on the wounds, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My heart pounded in my chest, the silence around me growing heavier with each passing second. The ground around the deer was disturbed, the dirt kicked up in a struggle, but there were no tracks, no sign of whatever had done this. I stood up, wiping my hands on my pants, and that's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl. It came from somewhere behind me, deep in the forest, but close enough that I could feel the vibration in my chest. My body tensed, every muscle locking up as I turned slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I swept the beam across the trees, trying to find the source of the sound. There was nothing, just the trees and the darkness beyond them, but I knew, deep down, that something was out there. Something was hunting me. I backed away from the deer, my pulse racing. My hand went to my radio, but I hesitated. What was I going to say? That I felt like something was watching me, that I'd found a deer that had been killed in a way I couldn't explain. I'd sound ridiculous, and I knew it. Instead, I turned and started back down the trail, walking faster than I probably should have. My flashlight cut through the dark, but it didn't feel like enough. Every step I took felt like it was being echoed by something else. A crunch of leaves here, a snap of a twig there. Whatever it was following me. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but it was getting harder. My chest felt tight, my palms slick with sweat despite the cold. The trail ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees closing in around me, and then I saw it again. That same dark shape, standing just off the trail, only a few yards away this time. I stopped dead in my tracks, shining my light directly at it, but instead of disappearing like before, it moved. It stood up. It was tall, impossibly tall, easily over 7 feet. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, and its arms hung low, almost dragging along the ground. Its face, I couldn't see its face, not clearly, but there was something wrong about it. Something twisted. The eyes, though. I saw those, bright, reflecting the light from my flashlight like an animal's, but filled with something far more dangerous, far more aware. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a rock as I nearly fell. The creature didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there staring at me. My heart was slamming against my ribs, my throat dry. I fumbled for my radio, pulling it from my belt with shaking hands. I stammered, my voice breaking. There's something out here, something big. The creature let out a sound, halfway between a growl and a scream, and took a step forward. I didn't wait to see what it was going to do next. I turned and ran. I've never run that fast in my life. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the trees, its footsteps impossibly heavy for something that had moved so silently before. The ground flew by in a blur as I tore down the trail, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I could see the glow of my truck's headlights in the distance, the only beacon of safety in the suffocating darkness. I didn't dare look back. I knew if I did, I might lose my nerve. I might stop. And if I stopped, I was dead. I reached the truck, flung open the door, and practically threw myself inside, slamming it shut and locking it. My hands fumbled for the keys, my breath ragged and uneven. The engine roared to life, and I threw the truck into gear, peeling out of the trailhead and barreling down the dirt road. As I drove, the headlights lit up the road ahead, but I didn't slow down. Not until I was miles away, back on the main road, with the dark woods far behind me. Whatever was out there, I wasn't going back. Not at night. Not alone. Some things in the forest aren't meant to be understood. Story 4. I've always loved camping, but after that night in Bear Creek Valley, I don't think I'll ever sleep in a tent again. Some things, once seen, can't be unseen, and some sounds, they haunt you forever. My name's Mike Collins, and I've been an outdoor enthusiast all my life. My wife Jennifer shares my passion, so when we had a long weekend coming up, we decided to try out a new spot we'd heard about, Bear Creek Valley. It was supposed to be beautiful, remote, and yes, known for its bear population. But we were experienced campers. We knew the precautions to take. We arrived late Friday afternoon, the sun already dipping low behind the pine-covered mountains. The campsite was everything we'd hoped for. A small clearing near a babbling creek, surrounded by towering trees. Perfect isolation. "This is gorgeous," Jennifer said, taking a deep breath of the crisp mountain air. "I can't believe we have this all to ourselves." I nodded, already unpacking our gear. "Let's get set up before it gets dark. I want to have time for a campfire tonight." We worked efficiently, falling into our usual routine. The tent went up quickly, our sleeping bags unfurled inside. I hung our food bag high in a nearby tree, standard procedure in bear country. As the last light faded from the sky, we had a cheerful fire going, casting flickering shadows across our little campsite. Jen and I sat close together, sharing a thermos of hot cocoa and watching the stars come out. The night was alive with sound, the creek's constant murmur, the wind in the trees, the occasional hoot of an owl. "This is perfect," Jen sighed, leaning her head on my shoulder. "Just what we needed to get away from it all." I kissed the top of her head, feeling utterly content. Absolutely. Though I wouldn't mind if a bear wandered by, from a safe distance of course, would make a great story. Jen chuckled. "Careful what you wish for, honey." If only I'd known how prophetic those words would turn out to be. We turned in early, tired from the drive, and set up. The tent was cozy, our sleeping bags zipped together for warmth. I drifted off to the sound of Jen's steady breathing and the forest's nighttime symphony. I'm not sure what time it was when I first woke up. The fire had long since died, leaving only the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the tent fabric. Something had disturbed my sleep, but I couldn't put my finger on what. Then I heard it. Heavy footsteps, crunching on the pine needles and twigs that carpeted the forest floor. My body tensed instinctively. "Jen," I whispered, gently shaking her shoulder. "Wake up." She stirred, mumbling sleepily. What is it?" "Shh," I cautioned. "Listen." The footsteps grew closer, circling our campsite. Whatever it was big. A bear, I thought. Has to be. Just stay quiet, and it'll move on. Jen's hand found mine in the darkness, squeezing tight. I could feel her trembling slightly. The footsteps paused near our tent. There was a loud snuffling sound, like something sniffing the air. My heart pounded so hard I was sure the creature outside must be able to hear it. Suddenly, something brushed against the side of the tent. We both flinched. The fabric bulged inward as whatever was out there leaned against it, its weight threatening to collapse our shelter. "Mike," Jen whispered, her voice tight with fear. "What do we do?" I racked my brain, trying to remember everything I knew about bear encounters. Stay calm, make noise, look big. But all of that advice was for being outside, face to face with the animal. What were you supposed to do when trapped in a flimsy nylon tent? The creature outside moved again. Its claws, yes, I could distinctly hear claws now, scraping against the tent's rainfly. It let out a low, rumbling growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. This was no ordinary bear. "Okay," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "When I say go, we're going to yell as loud as we can. It might startle it enough to run off." Jen nodded, her eyes wide in the darkness. "Ready." I took a deep breath. "Go!" We shouted at the top of our lungs, a wordless cry of fear and defiance. For a moment, there was silence. Then an ear-splitting roar shook the air, drowning out our voices. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, not quite bear, not quite wolf, but something alien and terrifying. The tent shook violently as the creature outside thrashed against it. Claws tore through the fabric, letting in the cold night air. Jen screamed, and I pulled her close, trying to shield her with my body. "We have to get out!" I yelled over the chaos. "Head for the car!" I fumbled for the tent zipper, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grasp it. Finally, I managed to yank it open. Cold air and moonlight flooded in, and there it was. Silhouetted against the night sky, a massive shape loomed over our tent. It stood on two legs, but it was no bear. The proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, head too large and oddly shaped, and the eyes, two glowing orbs that fixed on us with terrifying intelligence. For a moment, we all froze. Jen and I, half out of the tent, the creature poised to strike. Time seemed to stand still. Then survival instinct kicked in. I grabbed Jen's hand and ran. We burst out of the tent, bare feet slapping against the cold ground. I heard a roar behind us and the sound of pursuit, branches snapping as the thing gave chase. The car was parked about 100 yards away, at the small clearing that served as a makeshift parking area. It might as well have been a mile. We sprinted through the darkness, dodging trees and praying we wouldn't trip. "Don't look back," I gasped, though I was fighting the urge to do just that. The sounds of pursuit were getting closer. Whatever this thing was, it was fast. Jen stumbled, crying out in pain. I hauled her up, practically dragging her along. "Come on, we're almost there." The clearing came into view, moonlight glinting off our car's windshield. Just a few more yards. Something hit me from behind, sending us both sprawling. I tasted dirt and blood, disoriented by the impact. Jen's scream cut through the night. I rolled over, looking up at our attacker. The creature loomed over us, a mass of fur and muscle. This close, I could smell its musky animal odor. Its mouth gaped open, revealing rows of sharp teeth. This is it, I thought. This is how we die. But instead of attacking, the creature hesitated. It tilted its head, almost quizzically, studying us. Those intelligent eyes bored into me, and I had the unsettling feeling that it was thinking, reasoning. A long, tense moment passed. Then, to my utter astonishment, the creature stepped back. It let out a low growl, not threatening this time, but almost cautionary. With one last look at us, it turned and loped back into the forest, quickly disappearing into the shadows. Jen and I lay there, gasping for breath, unable to believe what had just happened. Finally, I found my voice. Are you okay?" Jen nodded, though I could see she was shaking uncontrollably. What was that thing?" I shook my head, wincing at the movement. Everything hurt. "I don't know. I've never seen anything like it." Slowly, painfully, we picked ourselves up. The forest around us seemed unnaturally quiet now, as if every creature was holding its breath. "Let's get out of here," Jen said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, Mike, I want to go home." I nodded, fishing the car keys out of my pocket with trembling hands. We drove through the night, not speaking, both lost in our own thoughts. What had we encountered out there? Why had it let us go? As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Jen finally broke the silence. "We can't tell anyone about this," she said. "They'll think we're crazy." Part of me wanted to argue, to insist that we report what we'd seen, but I knew she was right. Who would believe us? We had no proof, no evidence, just our wild story and our cuts and bruises. "Agreed," I said. "This stays between us." But as we drove on, heading back to the safety of civilization, I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes. Intelligent, curious, almost human. Whatever we'd encountered in those woods, it wasn't just some animal. It was something more. And deep down, I knew our paths would cross again someday. The creature had let us go this time, but would we be so lucky next time? One thing was certain. Our days of carefree camping were over. The wilderness held secrets, and some of them were better left undiscovered. Story 5. The first thing I noticed were the footprints. Huge, impossibly big for any animal that should be out here. But what made my skin crawl wasn't their size, it was that they circled our tent, over and over again. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. Rachel and I had been planning this trip to the Rockies for weeks. A break from work, from the endless noise of the city, from everything. Just the two of us and the wilderness. I'd been out here dozens of times, hiking and camping, but this was Rachel's first real camping experience. She was excited, nervous, and I could tell she was relying on me to be the experienced one, the one who knew what he was doing. That first day was everything we hoped it would be. We drove deep into the mountains, past the tourist-packed campsites, and found a remote spot off a dirt road that wasn't even on the map. The kind of place where you don't see another person for days. The sun was high, the air crisp, and the scent of pines surrounded us like a blanket of pure mountain air. Perfect. We pitched the tent in a small clearing near the edge of the forest, not far from a stream that babbled quietly through the rocks. After setting up camp, we spent the day exploring, hiking along a nearby trail, taking pictures, just enjoying the quiet. The whole time, Rachel had this wide-eyed wonder on her face, like the forest was some kind of magical world, totally different from the concrete jungle we'd left behind. That night, we built a small fire, roasted marshmallows, and talked about everything and nothing. The stars were brilliant, scattered across the sky like diamonds, brighter than I'd ever seen them back home. The wilderness was so still, the only sounds being the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. It felt like we were the only two people left in the world. But by the time we crawled into the tent and zipped ourselves up for the night, something had shifted. It wasn't anything obvious, not at first. Just a subtle change in the air, a feeling that settled into the pit of my stomach as I lay there, listening to the night sounds outside. The fire had died down to embers, the wind had calmed, and there was this strange, pressing silence. The kind of silence that makes you hold your breath without realizing it. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I was used to hearing distant voices, cars, the hum of the city, but out here there was nothing. I could hear Rachel's soft breathing next to me, her body warm under the sleeping bag. She was fast asleep, and I didn't want to wake her over some vague sense of unease, but I couldn't sleep. My eyes stayed wide open, staring at the fabric of the tent, tracing the outlines of the trees just beyond in the faint light of the moon. Every now and then, I thought I heard something, a crack, a rustle, just small sounds, the kind you'd expect from the forest at night, but they felt sharper, more deliberate. I convinced myself it was just wildlife, maybe a deer or a raccoon scavenging near the campsite. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I must have drifted off. When I woke up, it was early morning. Fog had settled in, thick and heavy, blanketing the clearing around us. The fire pit was cold, the remnants of last night's flames nothing but ash. Rachel was still asleep, bundled up, her face barely visible under her hood. I crawled out of the tent, stretching, and my boots crunched softly on the damp ground. The air was cold, biting at my skin, but it wasn't the chill that sent a shiver down my spine. It was the footprints. They were right there, clear as day, surrounding the tent. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. The way the fog blurred everything, how the ground had softened with the morning dew. But as I moved closer, squinting through the mist, I realized what I was looking at. Footprints, huge ones. They weren't human, they couldn't be. Each print was far too large, and the toes were splayed out like something I couldn't quite make sense of. Almost human, but not. Each print was at least twice the size of my own boot, and they circled our tent, over and over, round and round, as if something, or someone, had been pacing around us while we slept. I crouched down, my heart beating harder than it should have, running my fingers over the edges of one of the prints. The ground was pressed down deep, as though whatever had made them was heavy. My mind raced with possibilities, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but nothing fit. Bears didn't leave prints like this, and no person, no matter how big, had feet like that. I stood up, my breath puffing out in clouds of mist, my pulse thudding in my ears. The fog clung to everything, swallowing up the trees, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. I felt exposed, vulnerable. Suddenly, I wasn't so sure about this place anymore. I walked back to the tent and shook Rachel awake, gently at first, then more urgently when she groaned and tried to pull the sleeping bag tighter around herself. "John? What the hell?" she muttered, her voice groggy and irritated. "Rachel," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "you need to see this." Reluctantly, she sat up, rubbing her eyes and yawning. I helped her out of the tent, and her expression shifted from annoyance to confusion as she saw the fog and then, like me, her gaze fell on the prints. "What is that?" she asked, stepping closer. her voice rising with tension. Those are footprints, right? Please tell me those are just some kind of weird bear or something. I don't think so, I said, my throat dry. I've never seen anything like this. She crouched down next to one of the prints, her fingers hovering over the indentations in the dirt. John, this isn't normal. This is creepy as hell. I didn't have an answer. My mind was still racing, trying to piece together what could have possibly walked around our tent all night without making a sound. We should leave, she said suddenly, standing up, her voice trembling. We should just pack up and get the hell out of here. I wanted to tell her that it was probably nothing, that we were overreacting, but the truth was, I felt the same way. I didn't like the idea of staying out here another night, not after seeing those prints, not after realizing that whatever had made them had been so close. We started packing up the tent in silence, working quickly, both of us stealing glances at the footprints as if they might move or change. The fog seemed to thicken as we worked, the morning light barely penetrating the dense clouds that hung around us. The feeling of being watched crept in again, heavier this time, like eyes were hidden in the trees, observing us from just beyond the veil of mist. It didn't take long before we were ready to go. We grabbed our backpacks, and I slung the tent over my shoulder, both of us eager to get back to the car. As we started down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed, that whatever had circled our tent was still out there, keeping pace with us, just out of sight. Rachel kept glancing over her shoulder, and I could see the fear in her eyes, the way she walked faster, her hands gripping the straps of her pack tightly. I wanted to tell her it was all in our heads, that we were just freaking ourselves out, but I couldn't bring myself to say the words, because deep down, I didn't believe them. The fog pressed in closer as we walked, the trail barely visible ahead of us. The trees loomed like shadowy giants, their branches swaying gently in the breeze that we couldn't feel. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made us both jump, our nerves frayed and raw. And then we heard it, a low guttural sound, like a growl or a deep rumbling breath. It came from somewhere behind us, somewhere in the fog. We both froze. Rachel's hand gripped mine tightly, her eyes wide with fear. I slowly turned, my heart hammering in my chest, scanning the mist for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the endless white of the fog and the dark shapes of trees. But the sound was there. We both heard it. And it wasn't human. Without saying a word, we started moving again, faster this time, our pace turning into a near jog. The growl didn't come again, but the feeling of being hunted, of being stalked, clung to us like the fog itself. By the time we made it back to the car, we were both breathless, our nerves shot. We threw our gear into the trunk and climbed inside, locking the doors as if that would somehow protect us from whatever was out there. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing in the road behind us, but all I saw was the fog, swallowing the forest whole. We didn't talk much on the drive back to the city. What could we say? We both knew something had been out there with us that night, something that had walked around our tent, watching us as we slept. I haven't been back to that part of the Rockies since, and every now and then I still wake up in the middle of the night, hearing that low, rumbling growl in my head. And I wonder if whatever left those footprints is still out there, somewhere in the fog, waiting for its next visitors. Story 6. I've guided hundreds of hikers through these mountains, but nothing could have prepared me for that day. When the mist rolled in, it brought something with it, something that shouldn't exist. My name's Tom Reeves, and I've been a professional hiking guide in the Cascade Mountains for over 2 decades. I know every trail, every landmark, every quirk of the weather, or at least, I thought I did. It was supposed to be a routine 3-day trek, me and a group of 6 experienced hikers tackling one of the more challenging routes. We set out early on a crisp autumn morning, the air filled with the scent of pine and the promise of adventure. The group was in high spirits as we made our way up the winding trail. There was Sarah and Mike, a married couple in their 40s who were seasoned mountaineers. Then there was Jake, a college student with boundless energy, and his more reserved friend Lily. Rounding out the group were the Peterson brothers, Rob and Dave, who bickered good-naturedly as we hiked. By mid-afternoon, we had made excellent progress. We paused at a scenic overlook, the valley stretching out below us in a patchwork of greens and golds. "All right, folks," I said, consulting my map. "We're making great time. The campsite is about 2 hours ahead. If we keep up this pace, we'll be there well before sunset." That's when I should have noticed the first warning sign. A bank of clouds was rolling in from the west, much faster than normal. But I was focused on the trail ahead, confident in my knowledge of the area. We pressed on, the mood still light despite the darkening sky. Jake was in the middle of telling a joke when the mist hit us. It came out of nowhere, a wall of white that engulfed us in seconds. Visibility dropped to mere feet. I called for the group to stop and stay close. "Everyone, link up," I ordered, trying to keep the concern out of my voice. This fog's thicker than I've ever seen. We need to stick together." I felt the others gather around me, hands grasping backpack straps to maintain contact. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, and an eerie silence fell over the forest. "Tom?" Sarah's voice came from my left, tinged with worry. "Is this normal?" I hesitated before answering. "It's unusual, but not unheard of. We'll wait it out for a bit. If it doesn't clear, we'll backtrack to the last shelter we passed." But as the minutes ticked by, the fog showed no signs of lifting. If anything, it seemed to be getting thicker, and that's when we heard it. A howl echoed through the mist. Unlike anything I'd ever heard in these mountains. It was too deep for a wolf, too haunting for a coyote. The sound sent a chill down my spine. "What was that?" Lily whispered, her grip on my pack tightening. "Oh, probably just the wind," I said, not believing it myself. "These canyons can play tricks on your ears." Another howl answered the first, closer this time. Then another, from a different direction. We were being surrounded. "Okay, change of plans," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "We're going to head back to the shelter. Stay close, move quickly but carefully." We started back down the trail, or what I thought was back. In the thick fog, every tree, every rock looked the same. I've never been so disoriented in my life. The howls continued, sometimes far away, sometimes terrifyingly close. The group's fear was palpable. I could hear rapid breathing, muttered prayers. "Tom!" Mike's voice cut through the fog. "Look at this." I turned to see him pointing at the ground. There, in the soft earth of the trail, was a footprint, but not like any I'd seen before. It was huge, easily twice the size of my boot, and the shape, 5 toes, but elongated, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. "What the hell made that?" Dave asked, his voice cracking. Before I could answer, a branch snapped loudly in the forest to our right. We all turned, peering into the white void. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a dark shape, unnaturally tall, moving through the trees. Then it was gone. "Run!" I shouted, all pretense of calm abandoned. We took off down the trail, blind panic driving us forward. The fog swirled around us, shapes looming and vanishing in the mist. The howls grew louder, more frenzied. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that white haze. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror kept me going. Suddenly, the ground dropped away beneath me. I tumbled down a steep embankment, branches and rocks tearing at my clothes. I heard the others crying out as they fell too. I came to a stop at the bottom, dazed and battered. As I struggled to my feet, I realized with horror that I was alone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice hoarse. "Can anyone hear me?" Silence, just the swirling mist and the pounding of my own heart. Then a voice, faint but unmistakable. "Tom? Tom, where are you?" It was Sarah. I moved toward her voice, relief flooding through me. "I'm here. Keep talking. I'll find you." As I got closer, I saw a shape in the fog. But something was wrong. It was too tall, too inhuman. I froze. my blood turning to ice. The shape moved closer, and I caught a glimpse of glowing eyes, a mouth full of sharp teeth. This wasn't Sarah. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush. Branches whipped at my face. Roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't slow down. I could hear it behind me, moving with impossible speed. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I burst through a line of trees into a small clearing, and there, like a miracle, was the old ranger cabin we'd passed earlier in the day. I sprinted for the door, fumbling with the latch. Please be unlocked. Please be unlocked. The door swung open. I dove inside, slamming it shut behind me. For a moment, all I could do was lean against it, gasping for breath. Then I heard them. Voices, human voices, coming from the back of the cabin. "Tom, is that you?" I could have wept with relief. The others were here, all of them. They looked battered and terrified, but alive. "How did you all get here?" I asked, still trying to catch my breath. "We fell down that hill and just found it," Jake said. "But Tom, what's out there? We saw things in the mist." I shook my head, not sure how to answer. "I don't know, but we're safe now. We'll wait out the night here," and a heavy thud against the door cut me off. Then another. Something was trying to get in. We all backed away, staring at the door in horror. The pounding continued, the whole cabin shaking with each impact. "What do we do?" Lily whimpered. I looked around frantically, searching for a weapon, an escape route, anything. My eyes fell on an old CB radio in the corner. "The radio," I said. "Maybe we can call for help." I rushed to it, praying it still worked. To my amazement, it crackled to life. I grabbed the mic, ready to call out a mayday, but before I could speak, a voice came through the static. "Hello, is anyone there?" "This is Ranger Stevens at Cascade Base." "Yes!" I nearly shouted into the mic. "This is Tom Reeves. We're trapped at the old ranger cabin on Trail 23. There's something out here. Something—" A deafening roar drowned out my words. The cabin's window exploded inward in a shower of glass. A massive, hair-covered arm reached through the opening. "Send help!" I yelled into the radio. "Please, we're at—" The mic went dead in my hand. Outside, the mist seemed to press against the windows, seeping in through every crack. The pounding at the door grew more intense. We huddled together in the center of the room, watching in terror as the door began to splinter. "Tom," Sarah said, her voice surprisingly calm. "What do we do now?" I looked at the frightened faces around me, feeling the weight of responsibility. Whatever was out there, whatever was trying to get in, I had to keep these people safe. "We fight," I said, grabbing a broken chair leg. "Whatever comes through that door, we fight." As if in response, the door burst open. The mist rolled in, and with it came shapes, tall, inhuman shapes with glowing eyes. I raised my makeshift weapon, ready to face whatever nightmare had found us in the mountains. But deep down, I knew the truth. Our hike had turned into a fight for survival, and the night was just beginning. Story 7. The scream came from the valley below, a sound so unnatural it froze the blood in my veins. I'd heard coyotes, mountain lions, and even wolves in these woods before, but this was something else entirely, and it was close. I'm not the kind of guy to scare easily. As a wildlife photographer, I've spent countless nights alone in remote forests, waiting for the perfect shot. I've camped in grizzly country, waded through swamps in the dead of night, and even faced off with a mountain lion once. The wilderness doesn't scare me. It's where I feel most at home. So, when I heard the scream that night in the woods of Washington, it was like my entire body forgot how to move. One moment I was crouched behind my camera, focusing on the perfect angle of moonlight filtering through the trees, and the next I was frozen in place, my heart hammering in my chest. I was deep in the Olympic National Forest, miles from any town, any road, any human. I had hiked in earlier that day, carrying my gear with me, camera, tripod, a small tent, and enough supplies for a few days. The plan was to capture some long exposure shots of the night sky over the dense, ancient woods. I'd done it 100 times before in other forests, and tonight should have been no different. Except for that scream, I stayed crouched behind the camera, my hand hovering over the shutter button, trying to process what I'd just heard. It wasn't an animal. I know the sounds animals make. The eerie howls of coyotes, the chilling cries of mountain lions. This was different. It was too deep, too guttural, and it echoed through the valley like something massive was out there, something bigger than any predator I knew. I slowly stood up, scanning the dark tree line in the direction the sound had come from. My flashlight was clipped to my belt, but I didn't want to use it just yet. The moon was bright enough to see by, casting long shadows through the forest, and I didn't want to draw attention to myself, not until I had a better idea of what was out there. The forest around me was deathly still, no rustling of leaves, no chirping of insects, no wind, just nothing. It was like the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. I strained my ears, hoping to catch another sound, a branch snapping, a footstep, anything that would give me a clue about what was moving out there, but there was nothing. I glanced down at my camera, suddenly feeling exposed. The tripod was set up in a small clearing, an open space surrounded by towering pines, too open, too vulnerable. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. I swept it across the trees, my heart pounding faster with every second that passed in silence. Nothing. I knew I couldn't just stand there, waiting for whatever had made that sound to come find me. I needed to move, to pack up my gear and get out of that clearing. Quickly, I grabbed the camera from the tripod, stuffing it into my pack with shaky hands. My fingers fumbled with the straps as I worked to collapse the tripod, every nerve in my body on high alert. I kept my flashlight pointed at the trees, half expecting something to step out of the shadows at any moment. The scream came again, louder this time, closer. It sounded like it was coming from the valley just below me, the deep, throaty wail carrying through the still night air, like a warning. My stomach clenched, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. Whatever it was moving fast, too fast. I slung my pack over my shoulder, the tripod still half collapsed in my hand. There was no time to finish packing. I needed to get out of there. Now, I turned toward the trail that led back to my campsite, my legs already moving before my brain had fully processed the decision. The ground was uneven beneath my boots, the roots of ancient trees twisting up from the earth like skeletal fingers trying to trip me. I stumbled once, catching myself before I fell, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The trail was narrow, barely more than a footpath winding through the dense undergrowth. The trees closed in around me as I descended toward the valley, their branches hanging low, as if they were trying to pull me deeper into the darkness. I kept my flashlight pointed ahead, the beam bouncing wildly with every step I took. My breath was coming in short, ragged bursts now, the adrenaline coursing through my veins. And then, just as I reached the edge of the trail that dropped down into the valley, I heard it again, the scream. It was so close now, so much closer than before. My heart nearly stopped. It felt like it was right behind me. I whipped around, the flashlight beam slicing through the trees, my pulse hammering in my ears. The clearing where I'd been moments before was barely visible through the thick trunks, but nothing moved. No sound except the pounding of my own heartbeat. But something was there. I could feel it. That primal sense of being hunted, of something watching me from the darkness. I kept the flashlight pointed at the trees for a few seconds longer, my hand shaking so badly I could barely keep the beam steady. Then I saw it, just for a second, a shape. A massive, hulking shape moving between the trees, too big to be a bear, too upright. The light barely caught the edge of it, but I saw enough. The outline of something tall, its arms long and thick, its body covered in what looked like matted fur, and those eyes, two glowing eyes reflecting back the light, too high off the ground to belong to any animal I knew. It was watching me. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I bolted down the trail, my legs burning as I ran, the weight of my pack throwing me off balance. I stumbled again, this time crashing hard into the dirt, my hands sinking into the soft, damp earth. The flashlight flew from my grip, rolling off into the undergrowth. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in gasps, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I didn't stop to look for the flashlight. I didn't need it. The moon was still high, its pale light filtering through the trees, just enough to make out the path ahead. I ran as fast as I could. The sounds of the forest still unnervingly quiet around me. No birds, no wind, nothing, just the sound of my boots hitting the ground and my own ragged breathing. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I made it back to the campsite. My tent was still standing, my gear untouched, but I didn't stop moving. I grabbed my sleeping bag, stuffing it haphazardly into my pack, not caring if it fit or not. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the zipper closed. Every second felt like an eternity. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sending a fresh wave of panic through me. And then, just as I was about to sling the pack over my shoulder, I heard it again. The scream. This time it was right at the edge of the campsite. I froze, my body locked in place, the pack half on, half off. The sound was so loud, so close, it vibrated through my chest, shaking me to my core. Slowly I turned, my eyes scanning the dark tree line, the shadows shifting and moving in the dim light of the moon. And then I saw it. Standing just beyond the trees, barely visible in the shadows, was the figure, massive, towering over the undergrowth, its shoulders broad, its head too high off the ground to be anything human. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me with those glowing eyes. I don't remember making the decision to run. I just remember my legs moving, my feet pounding against the dirt as I sprinted down the trail, away from the campsite, away from that thing. I ran faster than I ever have in my life, not daring to look back, not daring to slow down. I don't know how far I ran, or how long it took me to reach my car, but when I finally stumbled out of the trees and into the gravel parking lot, I was soaked in sweat, my lungs burning, my legs shaking uncontrollably. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them twice before finally getting the door unlocked. I threw my pack into the back seat and slammed the door shut, my heart still racing. The car roared to life, the headlights cutting through the darkness, and I peeled out of the parking lot, the tires kicking up gravel as I sped down the narrow dirt road. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the highway, the lights of the nearest town just barely visible on the horizon. I never went back to that part of the forest. I haven't camped alone since. Whatever was out there that night, it wasn't something I could explain. And it wasn't something I wanted to encounter again. That scream still haunts my dreams, though it was something no animal should make, something that didn't belong to this world, and I'll never forget those eyes, watching me from the darkness, waiting. Story 8. I've always believed that a camera captures more than just light and color. It can reveal truths hidden from the naked eye. But that day in Shadowpine National Park, my lens caught something I wish I'd never seen, something that changed everything. My name is Emily Chen, and I'm a wildlife photographer. For the past decade, I've trekked through some of the most remote corners of the world, capturing images of nature in all its raw beauty. But it was a routine assignment in my own backyard that would prove to be the most terrifying experience of my life. Shadowpine National Park was experiencing a boom in wildlife activity, and the Park Service wanted a series of photos to document it. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day shoot, set up some trail cameras, take some shots of my own, then head home. Easy money. I arrived at the park just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the towering pines. The air was crisp with the first hint of autumn, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. I checked in with the ranger station, then drove to my assigned cabin, a small, rustic structure on the edge of a clearing. As I unloaded my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I chalked it up to city nerves and the growing darkness. Still, I made sure to lock the cabin door behind me. I spent that first evening setting up my equipment and planning my shot locations for the next day. Outside, the forest came alive with nighttime sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, normal sounds, comforting even. I woke before dawn, eager to catch the golden hour light. The morning was chilly, mist clinging to the ground as I made my way through the trees. I set up my first shot near a small stream, hoping to catch some early risers coming for a drink. Hours passed as I worked, moving from location to location. I got some great shots, a family of deer, a fox with its kit, even a black bear in the distance. It was turning out to be a productive day. As the sun began to set, I decided to check on the trail cameras I'd set up. The first few yielded the usual suspects, raccoons, opossums, the occasional coyote. But when I got to the last camera, tucked away in a dense thicket, something felt off. The area was eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, just an oppressive silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I quickly swapped out the memory card and headed back to the cabin, trying to shake off the unease. Back in the warmth and safety of the cabin, I started reviewing the day's shots on my laptop. The images were good, really good. The Park Service would be thrilled, but then I got to the trail cam footage. At first, it was the usual nighttime parade of wildlife. But then, at 3:17 a.m., something large moved in front of the camera. The infrared flash illuminated a shape that made my blood run cold. It was tall, far taller than a bear, and moved with an unnatural gait. The image was blurry, but I could make out long arms, a hunched posture, and what looked like fur. I leaned in closer, my heart pounding. This had to be a mistake. A bear standing on its hind legs, maybe, or two animals overlapping in the frame. But as I flipped through the next few images, I knew I was seeing something that shouldn't exist. The creature appeared in several more shots, always partially obscured by brush or shadow, but in one image it seemed to be looking directly at the camera. 2 pinpricks of reflected light where its eyes should be, and the suggestion of a face that was almost human. I sat back, my mind reeling. What was I looking at? Some undiscovered species, a hoax, or something else entirely? A noise outside snapped me back to reality. A branch breaking, followed by heavy footsteps. I froze, listening intently. The footsteps circled the cabin, slow and deliberate, then silence. I held my breath, eyes fixed on the window. For a moment, nothing. Then a shadow fell across the glass, something large, blocking out the moonlight. I caught a glimpse of movement, a flash of eyes reflecting the light from my laptop. It was looking in at me. I scrambled back, knocking over my chair in my haste. The shadow remained for a heart-stopping moment, then disappeared. I could hear it moving around to the front of the cabin. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone. No signal. Of course, I was on my own. The porch creaked under heavy weight. Something scraped against the door. Not knocking, but exploring, like it was trying to figure out how to get in. I grabbed my camera, more out of habit than any real plan. If this was how I was going to die, at least there'd be a record of what did it. The door handle jiggled. I raised the camera, ready to capture whatever nightmare was about to come through, but it didn't come in. Instead, after a tense minute that felt like hours, I heard those heavy footsteps moving away. The porch creaked again, then silence. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. When I finally worked up the courage to approach the window, the clearing outside was empty, just moonlight and shadows. Sleep was out of the question. I spent the rest of the night huddled in a corner, camera in hand, jumping at every sound. When the first light of dawn finally crept through the windows, I nearly wept with relief. I should have left then. Packed up my gear and gotten the hell out of those woods. But something compelled me to stay. Professional curiosity, stubbornness, or maybe just the need to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined it all. I spent the day in a daze, going through the motions of my assignment. But my real focus was on the woods around me. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves had me on edge. I took hundreds of photos, not of wildlife, but of the forest itself, searching for any sign of whatever I had seen. It wasn't until I was reviewing the photos that evening that I saw it. In shot after shot, partially hidden by trees or brush, was a figure, tall, fur-covered, always just out of focus. It had been there all day, watching me, following me. My hands shook as I flipped through the images. In one, taken near a small pond, I could clearly see its reflection in the water. The face was like nothing I'd ever seen, a mix of ape and man, with intelligent eyes that seemed to stare right through the lens at me. A scratching sound at the window made me jump. I looked up to see those same eyes peering in at me. It knew I'd seen it. The game of hide-and-seek was over. For a long moment we stared at each other. I raised my camera, almost on autopilot, and took a shot. The flash lit up the night, and I caught a full view of the creature's face. It was both terrifying and sad, ancient and knowing. Then it was gone, melting into the darkness with impossible speed for something so large. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, camera in hand, watching the woods, but the creature didn't return. When morning came, I packed up my gear with shaking hands and drove to the ranger station. I thought about showing them the photos, telling them what I'd seen. But who would believe me? I'd be labeled a kook, my career ruined. So I turned in my official photos, beautiful, safe shots of normal forest wildlife, and kept the others to myself. As I drove out of the park, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. One last time, I raised my camera and snapped a shot of the woods beside the road. Later, when I developed that final photo, I saw it, just a glimpse, half hidden behind a tree, two eyes staring out at me, a farewell, a warning. I've been back to Shadow Pine many times since then. I've never seen the creature again, at least not clearly, but sometimes when I'm deep in the woods with my camera, I feel those eyes on me. And in the background of my photos, if you look very closely, you might just see a shadow that doesn't quite belong. The forests hold secrets, and some of them have eyes that look back at us. I've learned to be careful where I point my lens, because sometimes the camera captures more than just an image. Sometimes it opens a door to a world we're not meant to see. Story 9. The first time I heard the whisper, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. The wind doesn't call your name, and the wind doesn't sound like it's standing just a few feet away, breathing down your neck. We were looking for a weekend getaway, something quiet, isolated, a break from the constant noise of work and the city. Emily had found this lake way up in Alaska on some travel forum. Supposedly, it was untouched, with hardly any tourists and only accessible by a winding dirt road that barely showed up on Google Maps. That was all the convincing I needed. I packed up my truck with camping gear, loaded up the cooler with enough food for a few days, and we hit the road. Just me, Emily, and a remote lake in the Alaskan wilderness. It was exactly what we wanted. No cell service, no people, just us and nature. I hadn't been camping in years, but the idea of escaping the world for a bit sounded perfect. The drive up was beautiful. The road cut through miles of dense pine forest, the trees towering over us like giants. We wound around mountains, past rivers and streams, the air getting colder and crisper the higher we climbed. By the time we reached the lake, the sun was starting to set, casting a golden light over the water. It was everything we hoped it would be, calm, pristine, and completely empty. Not another soul in sight. "Perfect," Emily said, hopping out of the truck and stretching. "This is exactly what we needed." I nodded, my eyes scanning the tree line surrounding the lake. It was peaceful, quiet, maybe a little too quiet, but I brushed that feeling aside. I wasn't used to this kind of silence. It would take a little adjusting, that's all. We set up camp right by the water, just a few yards from the shore. The lake was surrounded by thick woods, the kind that seemed to swallow up the sunlight even during the day. The water was so still, it was like a mirror, reflecting the mountains and trees that rose around it. No boats, no houses, just pure wilderness. The first night was uneventful, as most camping trips are. We built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and talked about nothing in particular. The stars were brighter than I'd ever seen them, and the air was so clear it almost felt unreal. It was the kind of night you dream about when you're stuck in the office, staring out at the grey city. But then came the second night. That's when I heard the whisper. We had spent the day hiking around the lake, exploring the area. There was something almost eerie about how untouched it felt, like we were the first people to ever set foot there. No signs of other campers, no trails, not even the usual wildlife. We didn't see a single deer, squirrel, or even a bird the entire time. But the lake and forest were beautiful, so we didn't think much of it, just enjoyed the solitude. After dinner, we were sitting by the fire, listening to the soft crackle of the flames and the gentle lap of water against the shore. Emily had already crawled into her sleeping bag, exhausted from the hike, but I stayed up a bit longer, staring out over the lake, thinking about how rare it was to find a place this untouched. That's when I heard it. A whisper, so soft it was almost drowned out by the fire. My name, Mike. I froze. The sound came from the direction of the lake. It was faint, almost as if the voice was carried by the wind, but the air was still. I looked around, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the water, but there was no one, just the dark, glassy surface of the lake reflecting the firelight. I shook my head, trying to shrug it off. I was tired. Maybe I'd dozed off for a second, and my brain was playing tricks on me. The isolation, the silence, it could make you imagine things, right? But then I heard it again, Mike. This time, it was closer. I whipped my head toward the sound, scanning the shore. My heart was pounding now. It sounded like someone was standing right by the water, just out of view, calling my name. The voice was soft, almost friendly, but there was something off about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on, shining the beam toward the lake. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the water, the rocks along the shore. Nothing, no one. I stood there for a moment, listening, straining to hear anything else. But the only sound was the gentle ripple of water and the occasional crackle of the dying fire. My heart slowly began to settle, and I tried to convince myself it was just the wind. Or maybe I'd imagined it entirely. I turned off the flashlight and crawled into the tent, zipping myself into my sleeping bag beside Emily. She was fast asleep, her breathing slow and steady, completely unaware of what had just happened. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the silence around us, my mind racing, the sound of that whisper replayed over and over in my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out here. But eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I didn't say anything to Emily about the whisper. I didn't want to freak her out. She was so excited about the trip, and I didn't want to ruin it by telling her that I'd heard something. Besides, maybe it really had been the wind. The mind plays tricks, especially in the wilderness. We spent the day fishing, lounging by the lake, and trying to soak up as much of the peace and quiet as we could. But I couldn't shake the unease that had settled into the pit of my stomach. Every time I looked at the lake, I found myself scanning the shoreline, half expecting to see someone standing there watching us. That night, as we sat by the fire again, I found myself glancing toward the water more than usual. Emily noticed. "You okay?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess." But I wasn't tired. I was waiting for that voice to come back. After a while, Emily went to bed again, leaving me alone by the fire. I stared out over the lake, my skin prickling with anticipation, waiting for the whisper. The fire crackled softly, the night as quiet as it had been the night before. And then, just as I started to relax, I heard it again. Mike. This time, it was unmistakable. The voice was closer, clearer, and it wasn't just calling my name. It was beckoning. I stood up, my heart hammering in my chest, the flashlight already in my hand. I shone the beam toward the lake, sweeping it across the shoreline. My breath caught in my throat. There, standing at the edge of the water, was a figure. It was too far away to make out any details, but I could see the silhouette of a person standing perfectly still, facing me. The figure was tall, motionless, as if it had been waiting there the whole time. "Mike!" The voice came again, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I felt a wave of cold fear wash over me. This wasn't right. This wasn't normal. There was no one out here, no one except us. I took a step forward, the flashlight beam steady on the figure. My pulse pounded in my ears, my mind racing. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. The figure didn't move. I took another step, but before I could get any closer, the figure turned slowly, deliberately, and walked straight into the lake. I watched in stunned silence as the figure disappeared beneath the surface, the water rippling around it before going still once more. There were no splashes, no sounds, just the smooth, mirror-like surface of the lake, reflecting the stars above. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the spot where the figure had been. My breath was coming in shallow gasps, my mind struggling to make sense of what I had just seen. "Mike!" The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't from the lake. It was right behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam swinging wildly through the trees, but there was no one there. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting between the trees and the lake, every nerve in my body on high alert. The whisper didn't come again, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I grabbed my pack, threw it into the truck, and shook Emily awake. "We're leaving," I said, my voice trembling. "Now." "What? Why?" She blinked at me in confusion, still groggy from sleep. "I'll explain later. Just get in the truck." She didn't argue. Something in my voice must have told her I was serious. Within minutes, we were speeding down the narrow dirt road, the lake and the figure vanishing into the darkness behind us. I never told Emily the full story of what I saw that night. I wasn't even sure I believed it myself. But I knew one thing for certain. Whatever had whispered my name by that lake, whatever had been standing at the edge of the water, it wasn't human, and it wasn't gone. I still hear it sometimes, in my dreams, that soft, beckoning whisper calling my name. Story 10. I've led hundreds of hunting expeditions, but nothing could have prepared me for that night in the Blackthorn Forest. What started as a routine trip turned into a desperate fight for survival against something that defied explanation. By dawn, I wasn't sure who was the hunter and who was the prey. My name is Steve Hawkins, and I've been a professional hunting guide for over 2 decades. I know these woods like the back of my hand, every trail, every creek, every animal call. Or at least, I thought I did. It was supposed to be a standard 3-day deer hunting trip. My group consisted of 5 clients, Tom and Jerry, 2 middle-aged buddies on their annual man trip, Sarah, a skilled huntress looking for a new challenge, and the father-son duo of Bill and young Mike, who was on his first real hunt. We set out early on a crisp October morning, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and small animals, a good sign for our prospects. As we hiked to our first hunting blind, I felt the familiar thrill of the chase. "All right, folks," I said, gesturing to the blind. "We'll set up here for a few hours. Remember, patience is key, and keep an eye out for any unusual movement." If only I'd known how prophetic those words would turn out to be. The morning passed uneventfully. We saw a few deer, but nothing worth taking a shot at. As we broke for lunch, I noticed Tom looking uneasy. "Everything okay, Tom?" I asked. He hesitated before answering. "Probably nothing, Steve. Just, does something feel off to you? The forest seems too quiet." I paused, listening. He was right. The usual background noise of the woods had diminished to an eerie hush. I shrugged it off, not wanting to spook the group. "Animals can sense hunters," I said. "They're probably just laying low. Things will pick up this evening." But as the day wore on, that uneasy feeling grew. We moved to a new location in the afternoon, setting up near a small clearing that was usually a hot spot for deer activity. Hours passed with no sign of game. As dusk approached, young Mike spotted something moving at the edge of the clearing. We all tensed, rifles at the ready. But what emerged from the underbrush wasn't a deer. It was a carcass, or what was left of one. The mangled remains of a large buck stumbled into view, barely recognizable as a deer. Great chunks of flesh had been torn away, its antlers snapped off at the base. The poor creature took 2 more stumbling steps before collapsing in a heap. "What the hell?" Jerry whispered, his face pale. I motioned for everyone to stay put and quiet. In all my years in these woods, I'd never seen anything like this. No predator I knew of could do this kind of damage. "Steve," Sarah's voice was tense, "we need to get out of here. Now!" I was about to agree when we heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not bear, not mountain lion, not anything that should exist in these woods. "Back to camp," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Move quickly but quietly. Stay together!" We set off at a brisk pace, the fading light making the forest seem more menacing with each step. I led the way, my rifle ready, every sense on high alert. We were about halfway back to our campsite when Mike let out a terrified yelp. I spun around to see him pointing at something in the trees. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of movement, something large, dark and fast disappearing into the shadows. "Run!" I shouted, all pretense of stealth abandoned. We took off, crashing through the underbrush. I could hear heavy footsteps behind us, branches snapping under significant weight. Whatever was chasing us, it was big. We burst into our campsite, gasping for breath. "Quick, get in the tents," I ordered, grabbing for the satellite phone. We needed help, and fast. But as I reached for the phone, a massive shape hurtled out of the darkness. It slammed into our supply tent, sending our gear flying. In the chaos, I caught glimpses of fur, claws, and teeth. Lots of teeth. "The truck!" Tom yelled. "We need to get to the truck." It was parked about a quarter-mile away at the nearest road access point. In the darkness, with that thing out there, it might as well have been on the moon. The creature, and I use that term because I still don't know what else to call it, turned its attention to us. In the dim light of our lanterns, I finally got a clear look at it. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur. But its face, it was like nothing I'd ever seen. Not quite bear, not quite ape, with intelligent eyes that gleamed with predatory hunger. It let out a roar that shook the trees, and charged. "And do scatter!" I yelled, firing off a shot that seemed to do nothing but enrage it further. We ran in different directions, the sound of pursuit following first one, then another of us. I crashed through the woods, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning. Behind me, I heard Sarah scream. I skidded to a stop, torn between self-preservation and the duty to protect my clients. The creature's roar echoed through the trees again, closer this time. I made my decision. Turning back, I raised my rifle and fired 3 shots in quick succession. The roaring stopped, replaced by a high-pitched whine. Had I hit it? "Sarah," I called out, "where are you?" "Here." Her voice came from my left, shaky but alive. I found her huddled behind a fallen log, pale but unharmed. "Are you okay? Did you see where it went?" She shook her head. "It was right behind me. Then your shots." "I think you scared it off." I helped her up, straining my ears for any sound of the creature. The forest had gone eerily silent again. "We need to find the others," I said. "Stay close." We moved cautiously through the woods, calling out for the rest of the group. One by one, we found them. Tom and Jerry huddled in a tree, Bill cradling a shaken Mike. As we regrouped, I did a quick inventory. Everyone was accounted for, scared but largely unharmed. But we were scattered, without supplies, and there was still a monster lurking in the dark. "Okay," I said, trying to project calm I didn't feel. "We stick together. Make for the truck. It's our only chance." We set off, moving as quietly as we could while still making speed. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every sound a potential attack. But somehow, we made it to the road without incident. The truck was there, a beautiful sight in the moonlight. We piled in, and I gunned the engine. not breathing easy until the trees of Blackthorn Forest were far behind us. As we drove back to civilization, the questions started. "What was that thing, Steve?" Bill asked, his arm protectively around Mike. I shook my head. "I don't know. In all my years out here, I've never seen anything like it." "We need to report this," Sarah said. "People need to know what's out there." I nodded, but doubt gnawed at me. Who would believe us? A monster in the woods. We'd be laughed out of every ranger station and police department in the state. As dawn broke, we pulled into the small town where we'd started our trip. The normal morning routines of people going about their day seemed surreal after what we'd experienced. I looked at my group, tired, scared, but alive. We'd gone into those woods as hunters and come out as survivors, but the haunted look in their eyes told me that none of us would ever forget what we'd seen. "Look," I said, choosing my words carefully. "What happened out there? It's going to be hard for people to understand. Hell, I don't understand it myself, but I promise you I'm going to find out what that thing was, and I'm going to make sure it never hurts anyone else." They nodded, a mix of relief and lingering fear on their faces. As they dispersed to call loved ones and try to process what had happened, I sat in the truck, staring back at the distant line of trees that marked the edge of Blackthorn Forest. Something was out there, something that turned hunters into prey, and I had a feeling our encounter was just the beginning. I've been back to Blackthorn many times since that night. I've never seen the creature again, but sometimes, when the wind is right, I hear a roar in the distance that makes my blood run cold. The forest holds secrets, and some of them have teeth, but I'll keep going back, because now I'm the one doing the hunting, and this time I'll be ready. Story 11. I've always been drawn to the unexplored, the hidden wonders of nature that few eyes have seen. But that day in the Crimson Caverns, I discovered that some things are hidden for a reason. Some darkness should never be disturbed. My name is Lisa Morgan, and I'm an experienced solo hiker and amateur speleologist. I've explored caves across the country, from the vast networks of Mammoth Cave to the icy depths of Alaskan glaciers. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found in those unmarked caverns. It was supposed to be a routine day hike in the Appalachian backcountry. I'd heard whispers of an unmapped cave system in the area, and my curiosity got the better of me. Armed with my usual gear, helmet, headlamp, rope, and a well-stocked backpack, I set out at dawn, the morning mist still clinging to the ancient trees. The hike was challenging, but invigorating. By mid-morning, I'd left the marked trails far behind, relying on my GPS and years of experience to navigate the rugged terrain. It was nearing noon when I saw it, a dark opening in the side of a cliff, partially hidden by dense foliage. My heart raced with excitement. This had to be the entrance I'd heard about. I approached cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of previous explorers. Nothing. This cave was untouched. I paused at the entrance, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The cool air flowing from the cave carried a musty, ancient scent. I switched on my headlamp and took my first steps into the unknown. The initial passage was narrow, forcing me to duck and squeeze through in places. But after about 50 yards, it opened into a larger chamber. My light barely reached the high ceiling, dotted with delicate stalactites. The floor was uneven, a mix of smooth stone and jagged rocks that required careful footing. I took a moment to mark my entry point on my GPS and in my notebook. Rule number 1 of caving: always know your way out. As I ventured deeper, the cave began to reveal its wonders. Crystalline formations sparkled in my light, creating a dazzling display. In one chamber, an underground stream had carved intricate patterns into the rock over millennia. I paused frequently to take photos and jot down notes, my excitement growing with each new discovery. But as I pressed on, a nagging feeling began to grow in the pit of my stomach. Something felt off. The air grew heavier, almost oppressive, and the silence, it was too complete. No dripping water, no echo of my footsteps, just a dead, suffocating quiet. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to the isolation. I'd been in plenty of caves before. This was no different. How wrong I was. I'd been exploring for about 2 hours when I came to a fork in the passage. Both options looked equally promising, so I chose the left path, making sure to mark my decision in my notes. The tunnel began to slope downward, taking me deeper into the earth. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. My light caught something on the cave wall, a series of strange markings. At first, I thought they were natural formations, but as I looked closer, my blood ran cold. They were claw marks, huge, deep gouges in the solid rock. "What the hell?" I muttered, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. I examined the marks closely, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Could it be from mining equipment? But these caves showed no signs of human activity, some kind of prehistoric animal. But nothing I knew of could leave marks like these. A low rumble in the distance snapped me out of my thoughts. It sounded like thunder, but that was impossible this far underground. I stood perfectly still, listening intently. There it was again. Not thunder, a growl. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to get out of this cave as fast as I could. But my curiosity, that damned curiosity that had led me here in the first place, urged me forward. I had to know what made those marks. I continued down the passage, my nerves on high alert. The claw marks became more frequent, along with other disturbing signs. Piles of bones, some ancient and fossilized, others disturbingly fresh. Strange, dark stains on the rock that I tried not to think too hard about. The passage opened into a vast chamber, so large that my light couldn't reach the far walls or ceiling. But what it did illuminate stopped me in my tracks. The floor was littered with artifacts, not ancient cave paintings or primitive tools, but modern items. Backpacks, cameras, climbing gear, all broken and scattered as if dropped in a panic. And among the debris, unmistakable shapes that turned my blood to ice. Human bones. My heart pounded so loudly, I was sure it echoed through the cavern. What happened here? What could have done this? Another growl, much closer this time, answered my unspoken question. I spun around, my light catching a glimpse of movement in a far corner of the chamber. Something large, something that shouldn't exist. I didn't wait to see more. I ran. I tore back up the passage, my light bouncing wildly, casting terrifying shadows. Behind me, I could hear it. Heavy footsteps, the scrape of claws on stone, and that growl, a sound that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. I reached the fork, nearly missing my marker in my panic. Left or right? Which way was out? My mind raced, precious seconds ticking by as I tried to orient myself. A roar shook the very foundations of the cave. I chose a direction and ran, praying it was the right one. The thing behind me was getting closer. I could hear its labored breathing, feel the vibrations of its movement through the stone floor. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror drove me forward. I burst into a chamber I recognized, the one with the underground stream. I was on the right path. Just a little further, my foot caught on a rock, sending me sprawling. My headlamp flew off, shattering against the cave wall and plunging me into darkness. For a moment, I lay there, dazed and winded. Then I heard it, slow, deliberate footsteps approaching, hot, fetid breath on the back of my neck. With trembling hands, I reached for my backup flashlight. As I flicked it on, I caught a glimpse of my pursuer, matted fur, razor-sharp claws, a face that was a nightmarish blend of bear and something else. Intelligence burned in its eyes, along with hunger. Our eyes locked for a split second that felt like an eternity. Then survival instinct kicked in. I scrambled to my feet and ran, blind terror giving me strength I didn't know I possessed. Somehow, miraculously, I found the exit. I squeezed through the narrow opening, feeling claws swipe at my backpack, tearing through the fabric. I exploded out of the cave into the fading afternoon light. But I didn't stop. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing in a clearing far from that accursed cave entrance. As I lay there, gasping for air, the full weight of what I'd experienced crashed over me. Tears streamed down my face, tears of relief, of lingering terror, of the realization that I'd come face to face with something that defied explanation. It was fully dark by the time I made it back to civilization. I debated whether to report what I'd seen. Who would believe me? A monster in a cave. I'd be laughed out of every ranger station and police department in the state. But the thought of those scattered belongings, those bones, haunted me. How many others had stumbled into that cave, never to return? How many families were left wondering what happened to their loved ones? In the end, I did file a report. As expected, it was met with skepticism. The authorities did a cursory search of the area but found nothing. The cave entrance, when I tried to lead them back to it, seemed to have vanished, hidden once again by nature or by something more sinister. I've never gone caving again. The darkness holds no more allure for me, but sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can hear a distant growl on the wind, and I know that out there, deep underground, something is waiting, watching, hungry. The world is full of undiscovered wonders, but some things are hidden for a reason, and some darkness should never be disturbed. Story 12. I never believed in monsters until that night in the forest. Now, I'm not sure what to believe anymore. My name is Sarah Callahan, and I've been a park ranger at Blackwood National Forest for the past 7 years. I've seen my fair share of strange things out here in the wilderness, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened on that moonless October night. It started like any other routine patrol. I was checking the perimeter of the eastern sector, making sure no campers had strayed into restricted areas. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and decaying leaves. My breath formed small clouds in front of me as I walked, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I'd just rounded a bend in the trail when I heard it, a sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was a low, guttural growl, unlike anything I'd heard before. Not a bear, not a wolf, not any animal I could identify. My hand instinctively went to the radio at my belt, but I hesitated. What would I even say? That I'd heard a spooky noise in the dark. Shaking off the unease, I decided to investigate. As I moved deeper into the woods, the undergrowth became denser, branches clawing at my jacket. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and my own quickening breath. Suddenly, my flashlight beam caught something on the ground. I crouched down, my heart pounding in my chest. There, pressed into the soft mud, was a footprint, but this was no ordinary animal track. It was massive, easily twice the size of my own boot, with distinct toe impressions that looked eerily human-like. I stood up slowly, my mind racing. Could this be some kind of hoax, a prank played by local kids? But deep down, I knew this was no joke. The print was too perfect, too fresh. As I contemplated my next move, a twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the trees. "Hello," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is Ranger Callahan. Identify yourself." No response came, but I could have sworn I saw something move just beyond the reach of my light. Something big. My training kicked in, and I began to back away slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the spot where I'd seen the movement. That's when I noticed the smell, a pungent, musky odor that seemed to fill the air around me. Another growl rumbled through the darkness, closer this time. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I fumbled for my radio, my fingers clumsy with fear. "Base, this is Ranger Callahan. I need backup at Sector E7. Possible. Large animal encounter." Static crackled in response. Of course, the reception out here was spotty at best. I was on my own. I continued to back away, trying to retrace my steps to the main trail. The forest seemed to close in around me, shadows dancing at the edge of my vision. Every rustle of leaves, every creaking branch made me flinch. And then I saw it. Just for a moment, illuminated by my flashlight, a figure loomed between two ancient oaks. It was tall, impossibly tall, and covered in dark, matted fur. But it was the eyes that froze me in place. They glowed with an eerie amber light, filled with an intelligence that was anything but animal. Our gazes locked for what felt like an eternity, but could only have been seconds. Then, with a speed that defied its size, the creature vanished into the underbrush. I ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I could hear it crashing through the forest behind me, always just out of sight. When I finally burst out onto the main trail, I didn't stop. I sprinted all the way back to my truck, slamming the door and locking it with trembling hands. As I sat there, gasping for breath, I scanned the tree line with wild eyes. Nothing moved in the darkness. The drive back to the ranger station was a blur. My colleagues found me babbling about footprints and glowing eyes, my uniform caked with mud and my face scratched from branches. They assumed I'd had some kind of panic attack, maybe brought on by an encounter with a bear, but I knew what I'd seen. And in the weeks that followed, as I pored over local legends and cryptozoology websites, I began to piece together a terrifying possibility. The natives of this region had stories of a creature they called the Watcher in the Woods, a being that walked like a man, but was not a man, standing guard over the ancient forests. I've requested a transfer to another park, somewhere with wide open spaces and fewer shadows. But on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, I can still hear that growl, and I know, somewhere out there in the darkness, it's watching, waiting. The experience has changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I find myself jumping at shadows, scrutinizing every unexplained sound in the forest. My colleagues have noticed the change, the way I tense up during night patrols, or how I insist on having a partner when venturing into the more remote areas of the park. I've become obsessed with trying to find evidence of what I saw that night. On my days off, I hike deep into the eastern sector, armed with a high-resolution camera and plaster casting materials for footprints. So far, I've found nothing conclusive, just more questions and a growing sense of unease. The locals have started to talk. They call me Sasquatch Sarah, behind my back, thinking I can't hear them. Some of the other rangers have tried to talk me out of my obsession, suggesting I see a therapist to deal with the trauma of what they assume was a bear encounter, but they weren't there. They didn't see those eyes, didn't feel the primordial fear that gripped me in that moment. How can I explain to them that the world as I knew it shifted that night? I've started keeping a journal, documenting everything I can remember about the encounter and any new information I uncover. It's become a lifeline of sorts, a way to convince myself that I'm not going crazy. The pages are filled with sketches of the footprint, descriptions of the creature's movements, and notes on similar sightings in the area over the years. There have been moments when I've doubted myself, when the rational part of my brain tries to explain away what happened, but then I'll be out on patrol and I'll catch a whiff of that musky odor or see a shadow move in a way that's just not quite right. And I know, deep in my bones, that it's out there. I've considered going public with my story, but who would believe me? Without concrete evidence, I'd be laughed out of my job and probably committed to a psychiatric facility. So I keep it to myself, this terrible secret that gnaws at me day and night. The worst part is the feeling of being watched. Even when I'm in town, grabbing a coffee or shopping for groceries, I can't shake the sensation of eyes on me. It's as if, by seeing the creature, I've somehow become part of its world, a world that exists just beyond the veil of what we consider normal. I find myself questioning everything now. If this creature exists, what else might be out there, hiding in the shadows of our world? Are there other rangers, hikers, or campers who have seen what I've seen but were too afraid to speak up? The forest that once felt like home now seems alien and threatening. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every snapping twig sets my heart racing. I used to find peace in the solitude of the wilderness. Now that solitude feels oppressive, filled with unseen dangers. I've started carrying extra equipment on my patrols. Not just my standard issue gear, but things like thermal imaging cameras and high-powered spotlights. My superiors have questioned this, but I've managed to pass it off as enhanced wildlife monitoring. There are nights when I lie awake, replaying the encounter in my mind. I try to remember every detail, every sound and smell. Was there something I missed? Some clue that could help me make sense of what happened? I've reached out to cryptozoologists and paranormal investigators, seeking answers. Most dismiss me as just another crackpot, but a few have shown interest. They've shared stories of similar encounters, of creatures that seem to exist in the liminal spaces between our world and something else. The more I dig, the more I realize that there's a whole hidden world out there. A world of unexplained phenomena and creatures that defy conventional explanation. It's both terrifying and exhilarating to think that we've only scratched the surface of what exists in the dark corners of our world. But knowledge comes at a price. I can never go back to the person I was before that night. The veil has been lifted, and I've glimpsed something that has forever changed my perception of reality. As I sit here in my cabin, writing this account, I can hear the wind howling outside, the trees creak and groan, and shadows dance across my windows. And I wonder, not for the first time, if somewhere out there in the vast, dark forest, it's thinking of me too, because one thing I know for certain, once you've seen the watcher in the woods, it never really stops watching you. Story 13. I've always loved the solitude of camping alone, but after that night in the Cascade Mountains, I don't think I'll ever sleep soundly in a tent again. My name is Mike Thornton, and I'm an avid outdoorsman from Seattle. I've been camping and hiking since I was a kid, and I thought I'd seen it all. Bears, mountain lions, you name it. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered on that moonlit night in the wilderness. It was late September, and I had decided to take one last solo camping trip before the weather turned. I chose a remote spot in the Cascades, about a 3-hour hike from the nearest ranger station. The area was known for its pristine beauty and abundant wildlife, but also for its challenging terrain and unpredictable weather. I set up camp in a small clearing near a babbling creek, the sound of rushing water a soothing backdrop as I prepared for the night. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the earthy aroma of fallen leaves. As darkness fell, I started a small fire and settled in with a cup of instant coffee, watching the flames dance and listening to the forest come alive with nocturnal sounds. It must have been around midnight when I first heard it, a howl that cut through the night, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a wolf or a coyote. This was something different, something primal. The sound sent a chill down my spine, and I found myself instinctively moving closer to the fire, as if its light could protect me from whatever was out there. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks, or some animal I wasn't familiar with. But deep down, I knew this was something else entirely. The howl came again, closer this time, and I could have sworn I heard a note of hunger in it. My hand reached for the hunting knife at my belt, a comforting weight against my hip. I scanned the tree line, my eyes straining in the darkness beyond the fire's glow. That's when I saw them, a pair of eyes reflecting the firelight, hovering about 7 feet off the ground. They blinked once, twice, and then vanished. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I scrambled into my tent, zipping it up as if that thin layer of nylon could offer any real protection. I lay there, every muscle tense, straining to hear any sound of approach. The night seemed to stretch on forever. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig had me flinching. I dozed fitfully, never fully sleeping, always on edge. When the first light of dawn finally began to filter through the tent fabric, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Cautiously, I unzipped the tent and peered out. The clearing looked peaceful in the early morning light, no sign of the terror I'd felt during the night. I started to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing, if the isolation and darkness had played tricks on my mind. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the soft earth around my campsite, but these were no ordinary animal tracks. They were massive, easily twice the size of my own boot print, with distinct toe impressions that looked disturbingly human-like, and they circled my entire campsite, as if whatever had made them had been pacing around my tent all night. My blood ran cold as I followed the tracks with my eyes. They led to my backpack, which I had left propped against a tree. It was shredded, deep claw marks raking through the tough fabric. Whatever had done this was powerful and had been mere feet from where I slept. I didn't even bother to pack up properly. I stuffed what I could salvage into my torn backpack and practically ran down the trail, my heart thundering in my chest. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat. It wasn't until I reached my car, hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys, that I allowed myself to believe I had escaped. The drive home was a blur. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. I'd heard stories, of course, tales of Bigfoot or Sasquatch roaming the Pacific Northwest, but I had always dismissed them as campfire stories or the products of overactive imaginations. Now, I wasn't so sure. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even in the safety of my apartment in the city, I found myself jumping at shadows and lying awake at night, straining to hear any unusual sounds. I became obsessed with researching cryptid sightings in the Cascades, spending hours poring over blurry photos and eyewitness accounts. I debated whether to report what I had seen. Would anyone believe me? Would I be labeled as just another crackpot who'd had too much whiskey around the campfire? In the end, I decided to keep it to myself, but the experience haunted me. I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. The way people's eyes would shift when talk of Bigfoot came up, as if they knew something but were afraid to speak. The number of missing hiker reports in areas known for strange sightings. It was like a veil had been lifted, and I was seeing a hidden world that had always existed just beyond the edge of what we consider normal. Weeks turned into months, and while the intensity of the fear faded, the memory remained vivid. I found myself drawn back to the wilderness, not out of a desire for solitude anymore, but out of a need to understand. I began taking day hikes in areas known for unusual activity, always with a camera and plaster casting materials for footprints. On one of these hikes, about 6 months after my encounter, I met an older man named Frank. He was setting up trail cameras, and we got to talking. As the conversation turned to local wildlife, I saw a look in his eyes that I recognized, the look of someone who had seen something they couldn't explain. Cautiously, I shared my story with Frank. Instead of the skepticism or ridicule I expected, he nodded gravely. "You're not the first," he said, his voice low, "and you won't be the last. These mountains hold secrets, son, secrets that some folks ain't ready to face." Frank became a mentor of sorts, introducing me to a loose network of individuals who had similar experiences. We would meet in small groups, sharing stories and comparing notes. Some were clearly embellished, products of overactive imaginations or too much time alone in the woods, but others rang true, echoing the primal fear and wonder I had felt that night in my tent. As I delved deeper into this hidden world, I began to see patterns. The sightings seemed to cluster around certain areas, often coinciding with Native American legends of spirit creatures or forbidden lands. I learned about infrasound, subaudible frequencies that some animals can produce, which could explain the overwhelming sense of dread many witnesses reported. But for every question answered, 2 more arose. If these creatures were real, how had they remained hidden for so long? Were they some kind of undiscovered primate, or something more otherworldly? The more I learned, the more I realized how little we truly knew about the world around us. My friends and family noticed the change in me. I became more withdrawn, spending less time socializing and more time in the wilderness. My apartment walls became covered with maps and photos, strings connecting sighting locations and dates. I knew how it looked, like something out of a conspiracy theorist's fever dream, but I couldn't let it go. There were nights when doubt would creep in. when the rational part of my brain would try to convince me that it had all been a mistake, a trick of light and shadow, combined with an overactive imagination. But then I would remember the sound of that howl, the glint of those eyes in the firelight, and the undeniable presence of those massive footprints, and I knew that, whatever I had encountered that night, it was real. A year after my experience, I returned to the same campsite. I don't know what I expected to find. Closure, perhaps, or vindication. The clearing looked much as it had before, nature having reclaimed any signs of my previous visit. As I set up my tent, a sense of déjà vu washed over me. The babbling of the creek, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, it was all so familiar. But this time I wasn't afraid. I felt ready. Night fell, and I sat by my fire, waiting. Hours passed, and nothing happened. No howls, no glowing eyes, just the normal sounds of the forest at night. As dawn broke, I felt a mix of disappointment and relief. I was packing up my gear when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. There, pressed into a patch of mud near the tree line, was a single, massive footprint. Fresh. A chill ran down my spine, but it wasn't fear this time. It was excitement. Whatever was out there, it knew I had returned. And somehow I knew this wouldn't be our last encounter. As I hiked back to civilization, my mind raced with possibilities. I had come seeking answers, but instead found a mystery that would likely take a lifetime to unravel. And I was okay with that, because now I knew the truth that so many refuse to see. Our world is far stranger and more wonderful than we could ever imagine. And sometimes, when the veil between the known and the unknown lifts, even for a moment, it changes us forever. The howl that had terrified me a year ago now called to me, beckoning me deeper into the unknown, and I was ready to answer that call, wherever it might lead. Story 14. I've been camping my whole life, but nothing could have prepared me for that night at Crystal Lake. What started as a peaceful getaway turned into a nightmare that still haunts my dreams. Some things, once seen, can never be unseen. My name is Jake Thompson, and my younger brother Ryan and I have been outdoor enthusiasts since we were kids. Every summer, we'd plan a camping trip to reconnect and escape the hustle of city life. This year, we chose Crystal Lake, a secluded spot in the mountains known for its pristine waters and excellent fishing. We arrived late Friday afternoon, the sun already dipping low behind the pine-covered hills. The lake was a mirror, reflecting the sky in perfect detail. It was breathtaking. "Man, this place is incredible," Ryan said, taking a deep breath of the crisp mountain air. "How did we never come here before?" I nodded, already unpacking our gear from the truck. "Let's get set up before it gets dark. I want to try some night fishing." We worked efficiently, falling into our usual routine. The tent went up quickly, our sleeping bags unfurled inside. As the last light faded from the sky, we had a cheerful fire going and our fishing gear ready. We sat by the lake's edge, lines cast into the dark water, sharing a beer and catching up on each other's lives. The night was alive with sound, the gentle lapping of waves, the hoot of an owl, the crackling of our fire. "This is perfect," Ryan sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Just what we needed." I was about to agree when something caught my eye. A disturbance in the water, maybe 50 yards out. At first, I thought it was a fish jumping, but it was too big, too deliberate. "Did you see that?" I asked, sitting up straighter. Ryan leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. "See what?" I was about to point it out when the disturbance came again. This time, we both saw it. A large shape, breaking the surface for just a moment before disappearing back into the depths. "Whoa," Ryan breathed. "That's a big fish," but something didn't feel right. The movement was too smooth, too controlled for a fish, and the size, it had to be at least 8 feet long. I don't think that's a fish," I said slowly, my eyes fixed on the spot where the creature had vanished. Ryan laughed nervously. "Come on, man. What else could it be? There's no such thing as lake monsters." I wanted to believe him, But as the night wore on, we saw the shape several more times, always at a distance, always just a glimpse. But each sighting left me more unsettled than the last. We turned in around midnight. The fire burned down to embers. As I lay in the tent, listening to Ryan's steady breathing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a splash, a big splash. I sat up, heart pounding, straining my ears in the darkness. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold, a low, rumbling vocalization, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite a growl, not quite a whale song, but something in between. "Ryan," I whispered, shaking my brother's shoulder. "Wake up, listen." He stirred groggily. What is it?" "Shh, just listen." We sat in tense silence, barely breathing. The sound came again, closer this time. Ryan's eyes widened in the dim light. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. Before I could answer, something large moved past our tent. The ground trembled slightly with each step. We froze, hardly daring to breathe. Whatever it was paused right outside our tent. I could hear it breathing, deep, raspy inhalations that spoke of something massive. The tent wall bulged inward slightly, as if the creature was leaning against it, smelling us. Ryan's hand found mine in the darkness, squeezing tight. I could feel him trembling. For what felt like an eternity, we sat there, paralyzed with fear. Then, slowly, the presence outside moved away. We heard more splashing, then silence. Neither of us slept for the rest of the night. As the first light of dawn filtered through the tent, we cautiously emerged. The campsite looked undisturbed, but the wet, muddy tracks leading from the lake to our tent told a different story. They were huge, unlike anything I'd ever seen, not quite webbed like a frog's, not shaped like any known mammal, and the stride length, whatever made these, had to be enormous. "We need to get out of here," Ryan said, his voice shaky. "Now," I nodded, already starting to pack up our gear. But as I turned toward the lake to grab our fishing rods, I froze. There, about 100 yards out, was a shape, a head and neck, rising at least 6 feet out of the water. As I watched in horrified fascination, it slowly turned toward us, 2 large, dark eyes fixed on our campsite. "Ryan!" I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Don't move!" He turned, following my gaze. I heard his sharp intake of breath. For a long moment, we stared at the creature, and it stared back at us. There was intelligence in those eyes, an awareness that sent chills down my spine. Then, slowly, it sank back into the lake, disappearing without a ripple. We broke camp in record time, barely speaking as we threw our gear into the truck. As we drove away, I couldn't help but look back. The lake was calm, giving no hint of what lurked beneath its surface. What do we do now?" Ryan asked as we hit the main road. "Should we report it?" I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my mind racing. Who would believe us? A monster in Crystal Lake. We'd be laughed out of every ranger station and police department in the state. Ryan nodded slowly. "So we just keep it to ourselves?" I sighed, conflicted. The rational part of my brain was already trying to explain away what we'd seen. A trick of the light. An undiscovered species of giant eel, anything but what it had appeared to be. But I knew what I'd seen, what we'd both seen. "For now," I said finally, "we keep it to ourselves. But we need to do some research, find out if anyone else has experienced anything similar up there." Over the next few weeks, we dug into the history of Crystal Lake. Most of what we found was typical tourist information, fishing reports, campground reviews. But buried in old newspaper archives and local folklore, we found hints, stories of mysterious disappearances, sightings of strange creatures dismissed as tall tales. We debated going to the authorities with what we knew, but every time we considered it, I remembered those intelligent eyes staring at us from the lake. Something told me that exposing this creature would be a mistake for it and for us. In the end, we made a pact. We would return to Crystal Lake, but not as hunters or whistleblowers. We would go back as observers to try to understand what we'd encountered. It's been 3 years since that first trip. We've been back to the lake half a dozen times, always cautious, always watching. We've had a few more sightings, each one filling us with a mixture of terror and awe. We're not the only ones who know about it now. On our last trip, we met an old man who's lived near the lake his whole life. He nodded knowingly when we hesitantly shared our experience. The lake keeps its secrets, he told us, and it's best we let it. Some things aren't meant to be understood, just respected. I think about those words often. The world is full of mysteries, some beautiful, some terrifying. What we saw in Crystal Lake was both, I still camp, I still fish. But now, whenever I'm near a large body of water, I can't help but wonder what's really lurking beneath the surface. And are there some depths that are better left unplumbed? One thing's for certain, I'll never look at a lake the same way again. Because now I know that sometimes, when you stare into the water, something stares back. Story 15. I've always believed that a camera captures more than just images. It captures moments, emotions, and sometimes things that shouldn't exist, but nothing could have prepared me for what my lens revealed in the depths of the Olympic National Forest. My name is Emily Chen, and I'm a wildlife photographer based in Portland, Oregon. I've spent the last decade traipsing through some of the most remote corners of the Pacific Northwest, documenting the region's diverse ecosystem. Bears, wolves, elk, you name it, I photographed it. But on that fateful day in late October, I captured something that defied explanation and shattered my understanding of the natural world. The assignment seemed routine enough, a week-long solo expedition to photograph the elusive Roosevelt elk during their mating season. I'd ventured deep into the heart of the Olympic National Forest, far from the well-trodden tourist paths. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, and a light mist clung to the ancient trees, creating an otherworldly atmosphere. I'd set up my blind near a small clearing, knowing the elk often grazed there in the early morning hours. As the first light of dawn filtered through the canopy, I settled in, my camera at the ready. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or distant bird call. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow moving at the edge of the clearing. I raised my camera, thinking I'd lucked out with an early elk sighting, but as I peered through the viewfinder, my breath caught in my throat. The figure that stepped into view was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It walked on 2 legs, but it wasn't human. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur, and it stood easily 8 feet tall. The head was a bizarre mix of ape-like and canine features, with a pronounced snout and eyes that seemed to glow with an inner light. My finger instinctively pressed the shutter button, the camera's rapid-fire click sounding impossibly loud in the stillness of the forest. The creature's head snapped in my direction, those eerie eyes seeming to lock onto my position despite the camouflage of my blind. For a moment, the world stood still. Then, with a speed that defied its size, the being vanished into the underbrush. I sat there, frozen, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Part of me wanted to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But the photographer in me, the part that lived for moments like these, kept me rooted to the spot. With trembling hands, I reviewed the images on my camera's display. Most were blurry, the result of my shaking hands and the creature's swift movement. But one was crystal clear. It showed the being in profile, its muscular form unmistakable against the backdrop of mist-shrouded trees. I knew I should leave, should get back to civilization and report what I'd seen, but curiosity overcame caution. I packed up my blind and began to follow the trail of broken branches and disturbed earth left in the creature's wake. The forest seemed different now, charged with an energy I'd never felt before. Every shadow held the potential for another encounter, every sound a possible warning. I moved as quietly as I could, my camera clutched to my chest like a talisman. The trail led me to the mouth of a cave, half hidden behind a curtain of moss and ferns. A musty, animal odor wafted from its depths, mixed with something I couldn't quite identify, something older. Common sense screamed at me to turn back, but I was in too deep now. I switched on my headlamp and stepped into the darkness. The cave was larger than it appeared from the outside, stretching back into the earth. My light revealed claw marks on the walls, some fresh, others worn smooth with age. Bones littered the floor, deer, elk, and others I couldn't immediately identify. As I ventured deeper, the air grew thick and heavy. My headlamp beam caught something on the far wall, and I moved closer to investigate. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was looking at. Cave paintings. Ancient ones, by the look of them. But these weren't depictions of buffalo or stick-figure hunters. These showed massive bipedal creatures with elongated limbs and wolf-like heads. They were crude, but unmistakably similar to what I'd seen in the clearing. I raised my camera, determined to document this incredible find. As I focused on the paintings, a low growl echoed through the cave. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. There, at the entrance to the cave, stood the creature. In the confined space, it seemed even larger, its presence filling the cavern with an almost palpable sense of ancient power. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I felt something I can only describe as a connection. Not friendship, certainly not kinship, but a sort of recognition, as if it was acknowledging that I had seen it, truly seen it, perhaps for the first time in centuries. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. I stood there, shaking, for what felt like hours before I finally found the courage to leave the cave. The hike back to my campsite was a blur. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me jumping, convinced the creature was stalking me through the forest. But I made it back without incident, collapsing into my tent as the last light of day faded from the sky. Sleep was impossible. I lay awake, replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Was it some unknown species of primate, a creature out of legend, like Bigfoot or the Wendigo, or something else entirely, something that defied classification? As dawn broke, I made the decision to cut my trip short. I needed to get back to civilization, to process what had happened and figure out my next move. The drive back to Portland was surreal. The familiar landscape seemed somehow altered, as if my encounter had changed the very way I perceived the world. I found myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see a massive, fur-covered form loping alongside the highway. Back in my small apartment, I immediately downloaded the images from my camera onto my computer. Most were, as I remembered, blurry and indistinct, but that one clear shot, it was undeniable. The creature stood in perfect focus, its features a haunting blend of the familiar and the impossible. I spent the next few days in a kind of trance, alternating between staring at the photo and researching every scrap of information I could find on similar sightings. The more I dug, the more I realized that what I'd seen wasn't entirely unique. There were stories, legends from Native American tribes and early settlers, of creatures that matched the description of what I'd encountered. The question was, what to do with this information? I knew that if I went public, I'd be labeled a crackpot, my reputation as a serious wildlife photographer ruined. But could I really keep this to myself? Didn't the world deserve to know that there were still mysteries out there? Creatures that defied our understanding of the natural world. In the end, I decided to reach out to a small group of cryptozoologists I'd come across in my research. I figured they'd be more open to what I'd experienced, more willing to listen without immediate judgment. Their response was enthusiastic, to say the least. Within days, I found myself on a conference call with researchers from across the country, all eager to hear my story and examine my evidence. As I recounted my experience, I could feel their excitement growing. The photo, they said, was one of the clearest pieces of evidence they'd ever seen. The cave paintings, if they could be verified, could revolutionize our understanding of North American prehistory. They wanted to mount an expedition back to the site, to search for more evidence and possibly set up camera traps. Part of me was thrilled at the idea of returning, of possibly seeing the creature again. But another part hesitated. I couldn't shake the feeling that by sharing my discovery, I was somehow betraying a trust. That connection I'd felt in the cave, it felt private, almost sacred. In the end, I agreed to guide them back to the general area, but not to the specific cave. Something told me that some secrets weren't meant to be uncovered, at least not yet. As I prepare for the upcoming expedition, I find myself changed in ways I'm still trying to understand. The world seems bigger now, full of possibilities I'd never considered before. Every shadow in the forest holds potential, every unexplored corner of the map, a possible home to things beyond our understanding. I don't know if I'll ever see the creature again. Part of me hopes I will, while another part dreads the possibility. But one thing is certain, I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again, because now I know that sometimes, when you point your camera into the unknown looks back. And in that gaze lies a truth both terrifying and wondrous. We are not alone in this world, and the line between legend and reality is far thinner than we dare to imagine. Story 16. I've spent my entire career studying the natural world, but nothing in my years of research could have prepared me for what I captured on film that day. Sometimes, the line between science and the impossible becomes blurred, and what you discover can change everything. My name is Dr. Carol Simmons, and I'm a wildlife biologist specializing in large mammal behavior. For the past decade, I've been conducting field studies in some of the most remote corners of North America. But it was a routine research trip to the Pacific Northwest that would turn my understanding of the natural world upside down. It started as a typical expedition. I was setting up a network of motion-activated cameras in a densely forested area known for its diverse wildlife population. The goal was to capture footage of animal behavior without human interference. Little did I know that these cameras would record something that defied explanation. I arrived at my research site just as dawn was breaking over the misty mountains. The air was crisp and heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. As I hiked deeper into the forest, the sounds of civilization faded away, replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. My first task was to check on the cameras I'd set up the previous week. I approached the first station, anticipating the usual footage of deer, elky, maybe the occasional bear or mountain lion. But as I reviewed the images on my tablet, my heart nearly stopped. There, in a series of nighttime shots, was a figure I couldn't explain. It was large, easily over 7 feet tall, and covered in what appeared to be thick fur. But it wasn't a bear. The proportions were all wrong. It stood upright, with long arms and a distinctly ape-like silhouette, yet it moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something of its size. My hands shook as I flipped through the images. In one, the creature was clearly examining the camera, its face tantalizingly out of frame. In another, it was striding through the forest, carrying what looked like a large branch with ease. "This can't be real," I muttered to myself, my scientific mind already trying to rationalize what I was seeing. A hoax, some kind of elaborate prank. But who would go to such lengths out here in the middle of nowhere? I spent the rest of the morning checking my other cameras, each one revealing more glimpses of the mysterious creature. By midday, I had dozens of images, each one more intriguing and perplexing than the last. As I sat on a fallen log, reviewing the footage for the 100th time, a twig snapped behind me. I spun around, my heart racing. The forest had gone eerily quiet. No birdsong, no rustling leaves. Just an oppressive silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Then I saw it, just for a moment, a flash of movement between the trees, something large, moving with surprising stealth for its size. I fumbled for my camera, managing to snap a single shot before it disappeared. With shaking hands, I checked the image. There, partially obscured by foliage, was a face that sent a chill down my spine. It was undeniably ape-like, with a heavy brow and wide nose, but the eyes, they held an intelligence that seemed almost human. I stood frozen, my mind reeling. What was I dealing with here? Some undiscovered primate species, a remnant population of some prehistoric hominid, or something else entirely? A low, rumbling vocalization broke the silence, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was coming from the direction where I'd seen the creature. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get back to my vehicle and never return to these woods, but the scientist in me, the part that had dedicated my life to discovery, kept me rooted to the spot. I had to know more. Slowly, cautiously, I moved in the direction of the sound. My camera was clutched tightly in my hands, ready to capture any evidence of what I was pursuing. The forest seemed to close in around me, shadows deepening despite the midday sun. I pushed through a dense thicket and found myself in a small clearing, and there, on the other side, stood the impossible. It was even larger up close, its muscular frame covered in reddish-brown fur. The creature stood upright, easily 8 feet tall, with arms that hung nearly to its knees, but it was the face that held me transfixed. Undeniably ape-like, yet with a quality that was almost human, and those eyes deep, brown, and filled with an intelligence that shook me to my core. For a long moment, we stared at each other. I raised my camera with trembling hands, managing to snap a single shot before the spell was broken. The creature let out a low, rumbling sound, not aggressive, but almost curious. Then, with a speed and grace that defied its size, it turned and melted into the forest. I stood there, my heart pounding, trying to process what I'd just seen. Part of me wanted to follow, to try and capture more evidence, but a deeper instinct held me back. I had intruded on something ancient and mysterious, something that perhaps wasn't meant to be fully understood by science. As I made my way back to my research station, my mind raced. What should I do with this discovery? The scientific community would demand proof, hard evidence beyond a few ambiguous photos. But something told me that exposing this creature to the world would be a mistake, not just for it, but for us. I spent the next few days in a daze, obsessively reviewing my footage and the single close-up photo I'd managed to take. Each time I looked, I saw new details that both excited and unsettled me. The way its hands were shaped, almost human-like, but with subtle differences. The intelligence in its eyes that spoke of a consciousness I couldn't begin to comprehend. As my expedition came to an end, I faced a dilemma. I had come here seeking knowledge, hoping to contribute to our understanding of the natural world. But what I had found was something that challenged the very foundations of that understanding. In the end, I made a decision that would shape the rest of my career. I compiled my most compelling evidence, a select few photos and video clips, and locked them away. The rest I destroyed. It felt like a betrayal of my scientific principles, but I knew it was the right thing to do. I did, however, write a paper, not about a new species discovery or anything so sensational. Instead, I focused on the gaps in our knowledge of North American wildlife, the possibility of undiscovered species in our own backyard. It was a call for more research, more exploration, but done with respect for the mysteries of the natural world. The paper was well received, leading to increased funding for wildlife studies in remote areas. And if some of my colleagues noticed a new intensity in my work, a fresh passion for the unexplored, they chalked it up to the enthusiasm of discovery. I've been back to those woods many times since then. I've never seen the creature again, at least not clearly. But sometimes, when I'm setting up my cameras or reviewing footage, I feel eyes on me. I'll catch a glimpse of movement just at the edge of my vision, or hear that distinctive, rumbling vocalization in the distance. And I'm reminded that the world is vast and full of wonders we have yet to understand. That sometimes The greatest discoveries are the ones we choose to protect rather than expose. I often think about those eyes, that face that was both familiar and utterly alien. And I wonder who was really studying whom in that forest clearing. In our quest for knowledge, do we sometimes miss the profound mysteries right in front of us? One thing is certain. My encounter in those woods changed me forever. It humbled me, reminding me that for all our scientific advancement, nature still holds secrets that may be beyond our comprehension. And perhaps, just perhaps, that's exactly as it should be. Story 17. I've been a hunter all my life, but that day in the Adirondacks turned me into the prey. Now, I'm not sure I'll ever be able to set foot in those woods again without looking over my shoulder. My name is John Hawkins, and I've been hunting in the mountains of upstate New York since I was old enough to hold a rifle. I thought I knew those woods like the back of my hand. I thought I understood the rhythms of the forest, the behavior of every creature that called it home. But on that crisp November morning, I encountered something that shattered every assumption I'd ever made about the natural world. It started as a typical hunting trip. I'd taken a week off work to camp out in a remote part of the Adirondack Mountains, hoping to bag a trophy buck before the season ended. The area was known for its large deer population, but it was also rugged and isolated, the kind of place where you could go days without seeing another human being. I set up camp near a small clearing, about a 10-mile hike from the nearest road. The air was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and decaying leaves. As night fell, I sat by my small campfire, cleaning my rifle and planning my strategy for the next day's hunt. The first sign that something was off came just before dawn. I was awakened by a sound I couldn't quite place, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. It wasn't a bear or a wolf, nothing I'd ever heard in all my years in these woods. I sat up in my tent, every muscle tense, straining to hear it again. But the forest had fallen eerily silent. Shaking off my unease, I geared up and headed out as the first light of day filtered through the trees. The woods seemed different somehow, charged with an energy I'd never felt before. Every shadow held the potential for movement, every rustle of leaves a possible sign of my quarry. It was mid-morning when I came across the first carcass. At first, I thought I'd lucked out and found a deer taken down by a predator. But as I approached, I realized something was very wrong. The animal, what was left of it, had been torn apart with a savagery I'd never seen before. Chunks of flesh were strewn across the forest floor, and deep claw marks scored the nearby trees. My first thought was a bear, but this didn't fit any bear attack I'd ever seen or heard of. The claw marks on the trees were too high, easily 8 or 9 feet off the ground. And the way the carcass was mangled, it was almost methodical in its brutality. I should have turned back then. Every instinct honed by years in the wilderness was screaming at me to get out of there, but curiosity and stubborn pride pushed me forward. I was determined to figure out what could have done this. I began to follow the trail of destruction. More claw marks on trees, patches of fur caught on low-hanging branches, and occasional smears of blood on rocks or fallen logs. Whatever had done this was big, and it was moving fast. As I tracked the creature, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees grew denser, blocking out more and more of the sunlight. The air became thick and heavy, filled with a musty odor I couldn't quite place. It was as if I was walking into another world, one where the rules I'd always known no longer applied. It was late afternoon when I heard it again, that same guttural growl from the night before, but closer now, much closer. I raised my rifle, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I scanned the trees, looking for any sign of movement. That's when I saw them, a pair of eyes gleaming in the shadows, about 7 feet off the ground. They were unlike any animal eyes I'd ever seen, glowing with an almost otherworldly intelligence. For a moment, we just stared at each other, hunter and hunted, though I wasn't sure which was which anymore. Then, with a speed that defied its size, the The creature burst from the underbrush. I caught a glimpse of matted fur, powerful limbs, and a face that seemed to be a nightmarish blend of wolf and ape. I fired off a shot, more out of reflex than aim, and the creature disappeared back into the shadows with a roar that shook the trees. I ran harder and faster than I ever had in my life, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I could hear it crashing through the forest behind me, always just out of sight but never far behind. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that primal state of fear. When I finally burst out of the tree line onto a logging road, I was gasping for breath, my legs trembling with exhaustion. I turned back, half expecting to see the creature emerging from the woods. But there was nothing, just the silent, ancient forest that now seemed to harbor secrets I'd never even imagined. The trek back to my truck was a blur. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me jumping, sure that at any moment I'd feel claws tearing into my back. But I made it, collapsing into the driver's seat and locking the doors with shaking hands. As I sped down the mountain roads, my mind raced. What had I seen? Some unknown species, a creature out of legend? Or had the isolation and the woods finally gotten to me, causing me to imagine things that couldn't possibly exist? But I knew deep down that what I'd encountered was real. The claw marks, the destroyed carcass, those eyes, they were burned into my memory, impossible to dismiss as mere hallucination. In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself obsessively researching cryptid sightings and local legends. I learned about the Wendigo of Algonquin folklore, the Dogman sightings in Michigan, and countless other stories of creatures that seem to exist in the liminal spaces between our world and something else. I debated whether to report what I'd seen, but who would believe me? I was known as a level-headed guy, not prone to flights of fancy. If I started talking about monster encounters, I'd be laughed out of town. So I kept it to myself, but the experience haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even back in the safety of my home, I found myself jumping at shadows and lying awake at night, straining to hear any unusual sounds. The woods that had once been my sanctuary now felt alien and threatening. My friends and family noticed the change in me. I became withdrawn, declining invitations to hunting trips and outdoor excursions. How could I explain that the activity I'd loved all my life now filled me with an inexplicable dread? Months passed, and while the intensity of the fear faded, the memory remained vivid. I found myself drawn back to the Adirondacks, not out of a desire to hunt, but out of a need to understand. I began taking day hikes in the area where I'd had my encounter, always armed, always alert. On one of these hikes, about a year after my experience, I met an old-timer named Frank. He was setting up trail cameras, and we got to talking. As the conversation turned to local wildlife, I saw a look in his eyes that I recognized, the look of someone who had seen something they couldn't explain. Cautiously, I shared my story with Frank. Instead of the skepticism or ridicule I expected, he nodded gravely. "And you're not the first," he said, his voice low, "and you won't be the last. These mountains hold secrets, son, secrets that some folks ain't ready to face." Frank became a sort of mentor to me, introducing me to a loose network of individuals who had similar experiences. We would meet in small groups, sharing stories and comparing notes. Some were clearly embellished, products of overactive imaginations or too much time alone in the woods. But others rang true, echoing the primal fear and wonder I had felt that day. As I delved deeper into this hidden world, I began to see patterns. The sightings seemed to cluster around certain areas, often coinciding with Native American legends of spirit creatures or forbidden lands. I learned about infrasound, subaudible frequencies that some animals can produce, which could explain the overwhelming sense of dread many witnesses reported. But for every question answered, two more arose. If these creatures were real, how had they remained hidden for so long? Were they some kind of undiscovered primate, or something more otherworldly? The more I learned, the more I realized how little we truly knew about the world around us. My perspective on hunting changed dramatically. The idea of killing for sport no longer held any appeal. Instead, I found myself drawn to wildlife photography and conservation efforts. I wanted to protect the wilderness and all its inhabitants, even those that defied explanation. 2 years after my encounter, I returned to the exact spot where it had happened. I don't know what I expected to find, closure, perhaps, or vindication. The forest looked much as it had before, nature having reclaimed any signs of the violence I'd witnessed. As I stood there, memories flooding back, I felt a familiar prickle on the back of my neck. Slowly, I turned to scan the tree line. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw a pair of gleaming eyes watching me from the shadows, but when I blinked, they were gone. I left the woods that day with a mix of emotions I'm still trying to sort out. Fear, certainly, but also a profound sense of wonder. Because now I know that our world is far stranger and more mysterious than we could ever imagine. And sometimes, when we venture into the unknown, we discover that we're not the top of the food chain after all. The experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I no longer see the forest as just a place for recreation or resource extraction. It's become a realm of infinite possibilities, a place where the line between reality and legend blurs. I still hunt, but now I hunt for knowledge, for understanding, and I know that somewhere out there in the vast wilderness, something is hunting too, something that reminds us that we don't know everything, that there are still mysteries to be uncovered and wonders to be witnessed, and maybe, just maybe, that's exactly as it should be. Story 18. I've spent 30 years tending this lighthouse, watching over these treacherous waters. But in all those years, I never imagined the real danger would come from the land. Some nights, the beam of my light reveals things better left in darkness. My name is Dave Hawkins, and I'm the keeper of the Stormhaven Lighthouse on the rugged coast of Maine. It's a solitary life, but one I've always found fulfilling. There's a certain pride in knowing that your vigilance keeps sailors safe from the jagged rocks and unpredictable currents that have claimed so many ships over the years. The night it all began was like any other. A nor'easter was blowing in, the sky a roiling mass of dark clouds. I'd just finished my evening rounds, making sure the light was functioning perfectly. The wind howled around the tower, carrying with it the taste of salt and the promise of rain. I was settling in for a long night of watchfulness when I first noticed something odd. Down on the narrow strip of beach below the lighthouse, barely visible in the gloom, was a set of tracks. Now, tracks on a beach aren't unusual in themselves, but these were different. They were huge, for one thing. Even from my vantage point high up in the lighthouse, I could see that, and the pattern was all wrong for any animal I knew. I've seen plenty of bear tracks in my time, but these were larger and shaped differently. They seemed to come out of the water and lead straight up towards the base of the cliff where the lighthouse stood. Odd, I muttered to myself, making a mental note to check it out in the morning when I did my beach patrol. But as the night wore on, things got stranger. Over the howling of the wind, I began to hear something else. A low, mournful sound that raised the hair on the back of my neck. It was like no animal call I'd ever heard before, somewhere between a wolf's howl and a whale's song. I tried to shrug it off as a trick of the wind, but the sound kept coming, growing closer each time, and then I saw it. Just for a moment, caught in the sweep of the lighthouse beam, a figure on the beach. It was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, and covered in what looked like thick and matted fur. Before I could get a better look, it vanished into the shadows. My heart was pounding now. What had I just seen? My mind raced through possibilities. A bear standing on its hind legs, some kind of elaborate prank. But deep down, I knew it was neither of those things. I grabbed my binoculars and flashlight, scanning the beach. Nothing, just the wind and the waves and that eerie howling sound. As the night wore on, the sightings continued, always just a glimpse, always at the edge of the light's reach. and those tracks, more appeared, circling the base of the lighthouse. Whatever this thing was, it was getting bolder. By dawn, I was a nervous wreck. The storm had passed, leaving behind a grey, misty morning. I made my way down to the beach, determined to investigate in the cold light of day. The tracks were still there, even clearer up close. They were like nothing I'd ever seen, enormous footprints with clear claw marks at the tips. I took photos and measurements, my hands shaking slightly as I worked. As I stood up, something caught my eye further down the beach. Half buried in the sand was something. I approached cautiously, my heart in my throat. It was a clump of fur, coarse and matted with salt water, and tangled in it was a piece of fabric, unmistakably a shred of clothing. I stumbled back to the lighthouse, my mind reeling. What was out there? And more importantly, what was I going to do about it? I spent the day securing the lighthouse as best I could, checking locks and barricading windows. As night fell, I found myself jumping at every sound, peering nervously out at the darkening beach. The creature returned that night and the next. Each time it grew bolder, coming closer to the lighthouse. I could hear it scratching at the walls, testing the door. The howls grew more frequent, filled with what sounded almost like frustration. On the third night, things came to a head. The creature seemed determined to get in, hurling itself against the door with bone-jarring thuds. I cowered in the upper levels of the lighthouse, clutching a flare gun, my only weapon. As I huddled there, listening to the sounds of the creature trying to break in, a realization hit me. The lighthouse. It was after the lighthouse. With shaking hands, I made my way to the control panel. Taking a deep breath, I switched off the light. The effect was immediate. The pounding stopped. The howling ceased. For a long moment there was only silence. Then, faintly, I heard heavy footsteps moving away from the lighthouse, back towards the water. I waited until dawn before venturing out. The door was dented and scratched, but had held, and there, leading back into the sea, was a fresh set of those massive tracks. Over the next few weeks, I grappled with what to do. I thought about reporting what I'd seen, but who would believe me? A sea monster attacking a lighthouse. I'd be laughed out of town, probably lose my job. So I kept quiet. But I also started doing research. I dug into local legends, maritime folklore, anything that might give me a clue about what I was dealing with. What I found chilled me to the bone. Stories of ships lured onto the rocks by mysterious lights. Tales of enormous creatures seen in the depths, and whispers of an ancient, aquatic race that supposedly once ruled these waters. It all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. The thing I'd seen wasn't trying to get into the lighthouse. It was trying to turn it off. The realization changed everything. I wasn't just a lighthouse keeper anymore. I was a guardian, standing between an ancient evil and the unsuspecting ships that passed by our shores. From that night on, I approached my duties with renewed vigor. I kept the light burning bright, no matter what sounds I heard outside, no matter what shapes I saw in the darkness. The creature still comes, especially on stormy nights. I can hear it circling the lighthouse, testing for weaknesses. Sometimes, in the beam of the light, I catch glimpses of it, a mass of wet fur, glowing eyes, a mouth full of sharp teeth. I've had to make modifications to the lighthouse, stronger doors, reinforced windows. I keep a more powerful flare gun close at hand, though I'm not sure it would do much good if the thing ever got inside. There are nights when the loneliness and fear almost overwhelm me, when the howling of the wind mingles with that unearthly cry, and I wonder how long I can keep this up. But then I think of the ships out there, the lives that depend on my light, and I find the strength to carry on. I've thought about trying to capture evidence to prove to the world what's out there, but something tells me that would be a mistake. This is an ancient conflict, a balance that's been maintained for who knows how long. Exposing it might do more harm than good, so I keep my vigil night after night. I tend my light and I watch the waters. And I pray that the barrier between our world and whatever lurks in the depths remains strong. Because out there in the darkness, Something waits, something that remembers a time before mankind ruled the land, when the seas held secrets we can't begin to comprehend. And as long as I'm here, as long as my light shines, those secrets will stay where they belong, in the depths of the ocean, in the shadows of legend. Every night as I climb the tower to light the beacon, I'm reminded of the true nature of my job. I'm not just guiding ships to safety. I'm holding back the darkness, keeping an ancient evil at bay with nothing but a beam of light and my own determination. Some nights, when the storm rages and I hear that mournful howl over the crash of the waves, I wonder how long I can keep this up. But then I look out at the vast, dark ocean and I know I'll keep this light burning until my last breath, because out there in the depths, something is waiting, and I'm the only thing standing between it and the unsuspecting world beyond these shores. Story 19. I used to think the most dangerous things in the forest were bears and getting lost. After what happened on that remote trail in the Rockies, I realized how wrong I was. Some things out there are beyond our nightmares. My name is Lisa Carver, and I'm an experienced hiker from Boulder, Colorado. I've trekked through some of the most challenging terrains in North America, from the Appalachian Trail to the Pacific Crest. But nothing in my years of outdoor adventure could have prepared me for what I encountered on that fateful day in the Rocky Mountains. It was early October, and I had decided to take a solo hike on a lesser-known trail in a remote part of Rocky Mountain National Park. The aspens were turning gold, and I wanted to capture some photos before winter set in. The trail was challenging, winding through dense forest and steep inclines, far from the popular tourist routes. I set out at dawn, the crisp mountain air filling my lungs as I began my ascent. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and small animals, the familiar crunch of leaves and pine needles under my boots, a comforting rhythm. I felt at peace, as I always did in the wilderness. It was around midday when I first noticed something off. The forest had gone eerily quiet. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I paused, my hand instinctively going to the bear spray on my belt. That's when I smelled it, a pungent, almost rotting odor that made my stomach churn. It was unlike anything I'd encountered before, not the musky scent of a bear or the sharp tang of a mountain lion. This was something different. I scanned the trees, my heart rate picking up. The rational part of my brain tried to dismiss it as just another strange forest smell, maybe a dead animal nearby. But deep down, I knew this was something else entirely. I debated turning back, but decided to press on. The summit wasn't far, and I told myself I was just being paranoid. I'd been hiking these mountains for years, after all. What could possibly be out here that I hadn't encountered before? As I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. There, caught on a low-hanging branch, was a clump of thick, black hair. Not fur, like from a bear, but hair, coarse and matted, unlike anything I'd seen on a wild animal. With trembling hands, I reached out and touched it. It was real, all right. I pulled out my phone to take a picture, my mind racing with possibilities. What kind of creature could this have come from? That's when I heard it, a high-pitched, piercing howl that echoed through the mountains. It wasn't a wolf or a coyote. This was something primal, something that sent shivers down my spine and made my blood run cold. I stood frozen, every muscle in my body tensed for flight. The howl came again, closer this time. And then I heard something else. The sound of heavy footsteps, branches snapping under significant weight. Whatever was making that sound was big, and it was coming my way. Panic overtook me, and I ran. I abandoned the trail, crashing through the underbrush, my only thought to put as much distance between myself and that sound as possible. Branches whipped at my face. Roots threatened to trip me, but I kept going, driven by a fear more intense than anything I'd ever experienced. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that primal state of terror. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I realized I had no idea where I was. The familiar trail was long gone, replaced by dense forest that all looked the same. As I stood there, trying to catch my breath and get my bearings, I heard it again. That same heavy footfall, methodically making its way through the forest, and it was close, too close. I looked around frantically for a place to hide and spotted a fallen tree with a hollow space beneath it. Without thinking, I dove into the cramped space, pressing myself as far back as I could. From my hiding spot, I could see a small section of the forest floor. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whatever was out there would hear it. I held my breath, willing myself to be as silent as possible. That's when I saw it. A massive, fur-covered foot stepped into view, but this was no bear paw. It was elongated, almost human-like, but far larger than any human foot I'd ever seen. The toes ended in sharp claws that dug into the earth with each step. I watched, paralyzed with fear, as the creature moved slowly past my hiding spot. I caught glimpses of matted fur, powerful muscles rippling under a thick hide. The stench was overwhelming now, a mix of rot and musk that made my eyes water. For a moment, it paused right in front of me. I could hear its heavy breathing, could almost feel the heat radiating from its massive body. I was certain it would discover me, that at any second those clawed hands would reach into my hiding place and drag me out. But then, mercifully, it moved on. I lay there, scarcely daring to breathe, for what felt like hours. When I finally found the courage to emerge, the forest was silent once again. I was lost, terrified, and without any real survival gear. My backpack, with my water and emergency supplies, had been left behind in my panicked flight. As the adrenaline wore off, I began to feel the cuts and bruises from my headlong rush through the forest. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. I knew I needed to find my way back to the trail, or at least to some kind of shelter before night fell. But every sound, every shadow now held the potential for danger. I jumped at the slightest rustle of leaves, convinced that at any moment I would again come face to face with whatever that thing was. I picked a direction and started walking, trying to keep the setting sun to my left, hoping it would lead me back towards the trailhead. The forest seemed different now, more menacing. The trees that had once felt like old friends now loomed over me, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. As darkness fell, I began to lose hope. I was cold, hungry, and utterly lost. The thought of spending the night in these woods, with that creature potentially still out there, was almost too much to bear. That's when I saw it, a faint glow through the trees. At first, I thought I was hallucinating, but as I moved closer, I realized it was real. A cabin, its windows warm with lamplight. I approached cautiously, relief warring with suspicion. Who would have a cabin this far out in the wilderness? But at that point, any shelter seemed better than spending the night exposed in the forest. I knocked on the door, my heart in my throat. After a moment, it opened to reveal an old man, his face weathered and lined. He took one look at me, dirty, scratched, and wide-eyed with fear, and ushered me inside without a word. The cabin was small but warm, filled with books and maps. The old man, who introduced himself as Frank, listened quietly as I poured out my story. I expected disbelief, maybe even mockery, but instead he nodded gravely. "You're not the first," he said, his voice low and serious. "These mountains hold secrets, secrets most folks aren't ready to face." Over a cup of strong coffee, Frank told me stories of other hikers who had encountered strange creatures in these woods, of Native American legends about shapeshifters and spirit beings. He showed me grainy photos and plaster casts of oversized footprints. I learned that night that there was a whole hidden world out there, a community of people who had seen things they couldn't explain and were searching for answers. Frank was part of this community, spending his retirement years documenting sightings and gathering evidence. As the night wore on, my fear began to transform into something else, a burning curiosity. Yes, what I had encountered was terrifying, but it was also incredible. If such creatures existed, what did that mean for our understanding of the natural world? Frank gave me a place to sleep that night, and in the morning he guided me back to the main trail. As we hiked, he told me more about his research, about the patterns he'd discovered in sightings across North America. When we finally reached my car, Frank handed me a card with a phone number. "If you want to know more," he said, "give this number a call. But be warned, once you go down this rabbit hole, there's no going back. The world will never look the same again." I stood there for a long moment after Frank had gone, turning the card over in my hands. Part of me wanted to throw it away, to forget everything that had happened and go back to my normal life. But a larger part, the part that had always driven me to explore, to seek out new challenges, knew that I couldn't let this go. That day in the Rockies changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I still hike, still love the wilderness, but now I see it with new eyes. Every shadow holds the potential for mystery, every unexplored corner of the map a possible home to things beyond our understanding. I've become part of that hidden community Frank introduced me to. We share stories, compare notes, and search for evidence of the unknown. Most people would call us crazy, and maybe we are, but we've seen things that defy explanation, things that challenge everything we thought we knew about the world. And out there, in the vast wilderness, something is watching, something that reminds us that we don't know everything, that there are still mysteries to be uncovered and wonders to be witnessed. Every time I lace up my hiking boots now, I feel a mix of excitement and trepidation, because I know that beyond the familiar trails and marked campsites, there's a world of the unknown waiting to be discovered. And sometimes, just sometimes, the unknown looks back. Story 20. I've been a fishing guide on Lake Superior for 20 years, and I thought I'd seen everything these waters had to offer, but what happened that foggy morning changed everything I thought I knew about the lake and about what lurks beneath the surface of our world. My name is Tom Erickson, and I've spent most of my life on the waters of Lake Superior. I know every cove, every rocky outcropping, every place where the big fish like to hide, or at least I thought I did. Now, I'm not so sure about anything anymore. It was early September, typically a great time for fishing on the big lake. The summer tourists had mostly gone home, and the serious anglers were out in force, hoping to land some trophy-sized lake trout or salmon before the harsh winter set in. I had a group of 3 men out that day, a father and his 2 adult sons, up from Chicago for their annual fishing trip. We set out just before dawn, the lake shrouded in a thick fog that muffled sounds and limited visibility to just a few yards around the boat. It was eerie, but not unusual for that time of year. We motored out to one of my favorite spots, about 5 miles offshore. The depth finder showed we were over about 200 feet of water, prime territory for big lake trout. As we cut the engine and began to drift, I helped the men set up their rods with heavy jigs, perfect for deep water fishing. The fog was starting to lift a bit as the sun rose higher, but the lake was unusually calm. No wind, no waves, just a glassy surface that reflected the grey sky above. It was almost too quiet. In all my years on Superior, I'd rarely seen it this still. We'd been fishing for about an hour, with only a couple of small catches, when I noticed something odd on the depth finder. A large mass was moving beneath us, much bigger than any fish I'd ever seen in these waters. At first, I thought it might be a school of fish moving together, but the shape was too defined, too singular. I was about to mention it to my clients when one of the sons, Mike, let out a yell. "I've got something big!" he shouted, his rod bending almost double. I moved to help him, thinking he might have hooked into one of those legendary 100-pound lake trout you hear stories about, but never actually see. But as I watched his line cutting through the water, I realized whatever was on the other end was moving far too fast to be a trout. The thing, whatever it was, circled the boat once, twice, dragging Mike's line with it. The reel was screaming, line peeling off faster than I'd ever seen. Then suddenly it stopped. The line went slack. We all stood there, staring at the water, waiting for something to happen. The surface was calm again, but I could feel a tension in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. That's when we saw it. At first, just a dark shape under the water, moving slowly towards the surface. As it got closer, I could make out more details, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It was huge, easily 20 feet long, maybe more. Its body was serpentine, but thick, with a broad head that reminded me more of a crocodile than a fish, but it was the eyes that really got me, large, intelligent, and fixed right on our boat. For a moment, it just stayed there, half submerged, studying us. I've been face to face with bears in the woods and seen some big predatory fish in my time, but I've never felt so observed. It was like this thing was sizing us up, deciding what to do next. Then, with a speed that defied its size, it surged forward. I saw a flash of teeth, rows of them, sharp as razors, as its massive jaws clamped down on the side of the boat. The whole vessel shuddered and tilted dangerously to one side. Panic erupted. The father and sons were yelling, grabbing for life jackets. I was frozen for a second, my mind struggling to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. There was nothing in Lake Superior that could do this, but it was real, all too real. I snapped out of my daze and lunged for the ignition key. The creature was still latched onto the side of the boat, trying to pull us under. I could hear the fiberglass creaking, starting to give way under the immense pressure. I gunned the engine, the sudden roar seeming to startle the creature. It released its grip, and I took the chance to steer us away as fast as the boat could go. I didn't look back, focused only on putting as much distance between us and that thing as possible. We were about halfway back to shore when I finally dared to slow down and assess the damage. There was a huge gash in the side of the boat, water slowly seeping in, but we were alive. Shaken, pale-faced, but alive. The men were silent as we limped back to the marina, all of us trying to come to terms with what we'd just experienced. As I tied up at the dock, I knew we had a decision to make. Do we tell anyone about this? Who would believe us? In the end, we agreed to keep quiet, at least for the time being. We explained away the damage to the boat as an accident, hit a submerged log, we said. But I knew I couldn't just let this go. Whatever that thing was, it was still out there. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with finding answers. I scoured old newspapers, looking for any similar sightings or unexplained incidents on the lake. I reached out to other fishing guides, carefully probing for any unusual experiences they might have had. Most dismissed me or laughed it off. Sea serpent stories were good for tourist business, they said, but no one really believed them. But a very few, got a look in their eyes when I asked, a look that said they'd seen something too, something they couldn't explain. One night, about a month after the incident, I got a call from an unlisted number. The voice on the other end was old, gravelly. "Heard you've been asking questions about the lake," it said. "Meet me at the old lighthouse tomorrow at sunset if you want answers." I debated whether to go. It could be a prank, or worse, someone looking to take advantage of my newfound obsession, but my need to know outweighed my caution. The next evening, I found myself climbing the worn steps of the abandoned lighthouse. At the top, looking out over the vast expanse of Lake Superior, was an old man. He introduced himself as Frank, a former lighthouse keeper. "The lake has secrets," he told me, his eyes never leaving the water. "Things that most folks aren't ready to know about, things that have been here a lot longer than us." Over the next hour, Frank spun a tale that seemed impossible. Yet after what I'd seen, I couldn't discount it. He spoke of ancient creatures living in the depths of Superior, of Native American legends that warned of water spirits and monsters. He showed me old photographs, grainy and unclear, but unmistakably showing something large and serpentine in the water. "They don't often come up to the surface," Frank explained, "but when they do, it's best to stay out of their way. They're not evil, not exactly, but they're not friendly either. We're just insignificant to them." As the sun set, painting the lake in shades of orange and red, Frank gave me a final warning. "Andre, you can keep looking for answers if you want," he said, "but be careful. Some truths are harder to live with than uncertainty." I left the lighthouse with more questions than answers, but also with a profound sense that the world was far stranger and more mysterious than I'd ever imagined. I still take people out fishing on Lake Superior. I still love these waters. But now, every time I look out over that vast expanse of blue, I wonder what's looking back. I've become more cautious in my routes, avoiding the deeper parts of the lake when I can. I've installed better sonar equipment on my boat, always watching for any unusual movements beneath the surface. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the lake is still, I swear I can hear something, a deep rumbling sound, like the breath of some enormous creature echoing up from the depths. Most days, I can almost convince myself that what happened was some kind of shared hallucination, a trick of light and shadow on the foggy lake. But then I'll catch a glimpse of something just below the surface, a shadow moving against the current, a disturbance in the water that's just a bit too big to be a normal fish, and I'll remember that day, and the eyes of that creature as it studied us. I don't know if I'll ever see it again. Part of me hopes I won't. But another part, the part that's always been drawn to the mysteries of this great lake, can't help but wonder what other secrets are hiding in its depths. One thing's for certain. I'll never look at Lake Superior the same way again. It's not just a lake anymore. It's a frontier, a last unexplored wilderness right in our backyard. And sometimes, when I'm out on its waters, I can feel the weight of its secrets pressing in all around me. Because now I know that beneath the surface of our familiar world, there are things beyond our understanding. Things that remind us how small we really are, and how much we have yet to discover about the planet we call home. Story 21. I've spent my entire career documenting the beauty and brutality of nature, but nothing could have prepared me for what I captured on film that day in the Pacific Northwest. Some secrets, I learned, are better left undiscovered. My name is Karen Mitchell, and I'm a wildlife filmmaker with over 2 decades of experience. I've tracked polar bears across the Arctic tundra, swam with great white sharks off the coast of South Africa, and spent months in the Amazon rainforest capturing footage of elusive jaguars. But it was in the familiar forests of my own backyard where I encountered something that defied explanation and changed my understanding of the natural world forever. It was late October, and I was working on a documentary about the ecosystem of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state. The project was meant to be a love letter to the lush, temperate rainforests I'd grown up exploring, showcasing the intricate web of life from the towering cedars down to the smallest insects. I'd set up a remote campsite deep in the Hoh rainforest, far from the well-trodden tourist paths. The plan was to spend a week capturing footage of the area's nocturnal wildlife, using state-of-the-art low-light cameras to reveal a side of the forest most people never see. The first few nights went smoothly. I captured stunning footage of owls swooping silently through the mist-shrouded trees, raccoons foraging along the forest floor, and even a family of Roosevelt elk bedding down in a moonlit clearing. It was on the 4th night that everything changed. I was reviewing some footage on my laptop when I first noticed it, a dark shape moving between the trees in the background of a shot. At first, I dismissed it as a bear or perhaps one of the elk, but something about the way it moved caught my attention. It was bipedal, moving with an almost human gait, but far larger than any person I'd ever seen. Intrigued, I rewound the footage and zoomed in. The image was grainy, the shape mostly obscured by the dense foliage, but what I could make out sent a chill down my spine. Whatever this was, it wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal native to these woods that I knew of. I debated whether to pack up and leave. Every instinct honed by years in the wilderness was telling me something wasn't right, but the documentarian in me, the part always seeking that once-in-a-lifetime shot, won out. I decided to stay and see if I could capture clearer footage of the creature. I set up additional cameras around my campsite, angling them to cover as much ground as possible. As night fell, I settled into my blind, a small camouflage tent that allowed me to observe without being seen. The forest was unusually quiet, the normal chorus of nocturnal insects and animals eerily absent. Hours passed with no sign of the creature. I was beginning to think I had imagined the whole thing when I heard it, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the very earth. It wasn't quite a growl, not quite a roar, but something in between that raised the hair on the back of my neck. I peered out through the blind's viewing slot, my night vision camera at the ready. The forest seemed to hold its breath, every shadow potentially hiding the source of that unearthly sound. And then I saw it. It emerged from between two ancient cedars, moving with a fluid grace that belied its massive size. In the green glow of my night vision camera, I could make out a form that seemed to be a nightmarish blend of ape and wolf, powerfully built, covered in shaggy fur, with a head that was vaguely canine in shape, but with eyes that reflected an unsettling intelligence. My hands shook as I filmed, torn between professional excitement at capturing something truly extraordinary and primal fear at being in the presence of a creature that shouldn't exist. It moved through the clearing with purpose, seeming to inspect the area methodically. As it neared my blind, it paused, lifting its head to scent the air. I held my breath, praying that the camouflage and scent-masking techniques I'd used would be enough to conceal my presence. For a heart-stopping moment, its gaze seemed to fix directly on me. Those eyes, glowing in the infrared light of my camera, held an awareness that was all too human. Just when I thought discovery was inevitable, a sound from deeper in the forest caught the creature's attention. Its head snapped around, and with shocking speed for something its size, it loped off into the darkness. I sat there barely breathing for what felt like hours. When I finally found the courage to emerge from the blind, the forest seemed different somehow. The familiar trees and undergrowth that I'd known since childhood now felt alien and threatening, harboring secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover. As dawn broke, I reviewed the footage with shaking hands. It was all there, clear, undeniable evidence of something that couldn't possibly exist. I should have felt elated. This was the kind of discovery that could make a career, that could revolutionize our understanding of zoology and evolution. Instead, I felt a deep sense of unease. I spent the day in a daze, absent-mindedly going through the motions of breaking down my campsite. Part of me wanted to stay, to try and capture more footage, to unravel the mystery of what I'd seen. But a larger part, the part honed by years of survival instinct, knew it was time to leave. As I was packing up my last camera, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, pressed into a patch of soft earth, was a footprint, but this was no bear track or elk hoof print. It was massive, easily twice the size of my own foot, with distinct toe impressions that looked disturbingly human-like. I stared at the print for a long moment, my mind racing. If I made a cast of this, combined with the video footage, I'd have concrete evidence of something that could turn the scientific world on its head. But as I reached for my plaster kit, a twig snapped in the forest behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding. The woods were still, no sign of movement, but I could feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows. Without thinking, I grabbed my backpack and ran, leaving the footprint and the last camera behind. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my lungs burning and legs shaking from the effort. The drive back to civilization was a blur. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, what I'd recorded. By the time I reached my small apartment in Seattle, I had convinced myself that I needed to go public with the footage. This was too big to keep to myself. But as I sat down to review the recordings, my heart sank. The clear, unmistakable images I remembered capturing were gone. Instead, there were only vague shadows, movements that could be explained away as known animals or tricks of light and shadow. Even the shot where I'd clearly seen the creature's eyes was now just a lens flare, a reflection of my own camera's infrared light. I spent days poring over the footage, trying to find any clear evidence of what I'd seen, but it was useless. Whatever had been there that night had managed to elude definitive capture on film. I was left with nothing but my memories and a lingering sense of unease. In the weeks that followed, I debated what to do. I could go public with what I had, but without clear evidence, I'd be labeled a crackpot, my reputation as a serious documentarian ruined. I could go back to the Ho, try to capture more footage, but the thought of encountering that creature again filled me with dread. In the end, I decided to keep the experience to myself, at least for the time being. I completed my documentary on the Olympic Peninsula ecosystem, carefully editing out any hint of what I'd seen that night, but I couldn't let it go entirely. I began researching, diving deep into Native American legends of the area, accounts of strange sightings in the Pacific Northwest over the years. I discovered a whole community of people who had experienced similar encounters, who believed that something unknown was living in the vast wilderness areas of North America. Most dismissed these stories as folklore or the product of overactive imaginations. But I knew better. I'd seen it with my own eyes, felt the weight of its gaze. And while I couldn't prove it, I knew that out there, in the mist-shrouded forests of the Pacific Northwest, something was watching. Something that challenged everything we thought we knew about the natural world. My experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I still make nature documentaries, still love the wilderness. But now, every time I set up a camera in a remote location, every time I settle into a blind to wait for the perfect shot, there's a part of me that wonders what might be watching back. I've become more cautious in my work, more aware of the vast unknowns that still exist in our world. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the forest and the mist rolls in, I can almost convince myself that it was all a dream, a product of too many nights alone in the wilderness. But then I'll catch a glimpse of something moving just at the edge of my vision, or hear a sound that doesn't quite fit with the normal forest chorus. And I'll remember that night in the Ho and the eyes of that creature as it studied me through the blind. I don't know if I'll ever see it again. Part of me hopes I won't, but another part, the part that's always driven me to seek out the unknown, can't help but wonder what other secrets are hiding in the shadows of our world. One thing's for certain, I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. It's not just a subject for my documentaries anymore. It's a reminder that there are still mysteries out there, things beyond our understanding. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the wild with just my camera, I can feel the weight of those secrets all around me. Because now I know that beyond the edges of our maps, in the places where the wild still reigns, there are things that defy explanation, things that remind us how little we truly know about the world we inhabit. Story 22. I've explored caves all over the world, but nothing could have prepared me for what I found in that remote cavern in the Ozarks. Some depths, I learned, are better left unplumbed. My name is Rick Sanderson, and I've been a spelunker for over 15 years. I've squeezed through tight passages in Vietnam's Son Doong Cave, rappelled into Mexico's Cave of Swallows, and navigated the underwater tunnels of the Bahamas' Blue Holes. But it was in a little-known cave system in my own backyard of Missouri where I encountered something that defied explanation and shook my understanding of the world to its core. It was late November, and I had taken a week off work to explore a newly discovered cave system in the Ozark Mountains. The entrance had been found by a local hiker, hidden behind a thick curtain of vegetation on a steep hillside. Initial surveys suggested it might be part of a larger network, potentially rivaling some of the more famous cave systems in the area. I arrived at the site early in the morning, the air crisp with the promise of winter. The cave entrance was a dark slash in the limestone cliff face, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. As I double-checked my gear, helmet, headlamp, rope, first aid kit, I felt the familiar mix of excitement and apprehension that always preceded a new exploration. The first part of the cave was typical for the region. a series of narrow passages and small chambers, their walls adorned with delicate formations of stalactites and flowstone. I moved carefully, mapping as I went, always alert for signs of instability or hidden passages. It was about 2 hours into my exploration when I noticed something odd. The passage I was following opened into a larger chamber, and as my headlamp swept across the far wall, I saw something that made me pause. There, etched into the rock face, were markings, but these weren't the typical graffiti left by careless tourists. These looked old, ancient even. I approached for a closer look, my heart racing with excitement. The markings were crude, but deliberate. A series of parallel lines, circles, and what looked like stylized animal figures, but it was the central image that really caught my attention. It depicted a bipedal figure much larger than the animals around it, with an elongated head and what appeared to be claws. My mind raced with questions. Who had made these markings? How long ago? And what was this strange creature they had depicted? I knew that Native American tribes had inhabited this region for thousands of years, but I'd never seen cave art quite like this before. I spent some time photographing the markings before continuing deeper into the cave. The passage narrowed again, forcing me to crouch and then crawl. The air grew cooler, and I could hear the distant sound of running water echoing through the rock. As I emerged from the tight passage into another chamber, the smell hit me, a pungent, musky odor that made my nose wrinkle. It reminded me of animal dens I'd encountered before, but stronger, more primal somehow. My headlamp beam caught something on the chamber floor. Bones, a lot of them. At first, I thought I'd stumbled upon an ancient midden heap, perhaps left by early human inhabitants of the cave. But as I examined them closer, I realized many of these bones were fresh. Some still had scraps of flesh clinging to them. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool cave air. Whatever had made this pile was big, and judging by the variety of bones, deer, raccoon, what looked like bear, it wasn't picky about its prey. I was debating whether to press on or turn back when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very rock around me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. That was no sound I'd ever heard in a cave before. Not a mountain lion, not a bear. This was something else entirely. The rational part of my brain tried to dismiss it as just the wind or water moving through the cave system, but deep down, I knew this was something else. Something that shouldn't be here. I switched off my headlamp, plunging myself into total darkness. In the pitch black, my other senses heightened. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud in my ears, and something else, the soft scrape of claws on stone, drawing nearer. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, I stood there in the dark, scarcely daring to breathe. The scraping sound grew closer, accompanied by that low, rumbling growl. It was in the chamber with me now. I don't know what made me do it, curiosity, madness, or some primal instinct to face the threat, but I switched my headlamp back on. For a split second, I saw it, a massive form, easily 8 feet tall, covered in shaggy fur, but it was the face that seared itself into my memory, a blend of ape and wolf, with eyes that glowed red in the beam of my headlamp. Eyes that held an intelligence that was terrifyingly human. Then, with a roar that shook loose debris from the cave ceiling, it charged. I ran harder and faster than I ever had in my life, my headlamp beam bouncing wildly as I scrambled back the way I'd come. I could hear it behind me, its massive form squeezing through passages that I'd barely fit through. How I made it out of that cave, I'll never know. By the time I burst out of the entrance and into the fading daylight, my clothes were torn, my body scraped and bruised. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, fumbling with shaking hands to unlock the door and start the engine. As I sped down the winding mountain road, my mind raced. What had I seen? Some unknown species of cave-dwelling primate, a creature out of Native American legend? Or had the isolation and darkness played some horrible trick on my senses? In the days that followed, I debated whether to report what I'd seen, but who would believe me? I was known in the spelunking community as level-headed, not prone to flights of fancy. If I started talking about monsters in caves, I'd be laughed out of every expedition, so I kept it to myself. But the experience haunted me. I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes, that terrible intelligence behind them. I threw myself into research, poring over Native American legends, accounts of strange sightings in the Ozarks over the years. I discovered a whole community of people who had experienced similar encounters, who believed that something unknown was living in the vast cave systems of North America. Most dismissed these stories as campfire tales or the product of overactive imaginations in the dark. But I knew better. I had seen it with my own eyes, felt the heat of its breath as it charged me in that underground chamber. My experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I still cave, still love the thrill of exploration. But now, every time I squeeze through a tight passage or enter a new chamber, there's a part of me that wonders what might be lurking in the shadows. I've become more cautious in my explorations, more aware of the vastness of the unknown that exists right beneath our feet. And sometimes, when I'm deep underground and my headlamp catches a strange shadow or I hear an unexplained sound echoing through the rock, I can almost convince myself that it was all a dream, a product of too much time alone in the dark. But then I'll catch a whiff of that musky odor or see claw marks on a cave wall that don't match any known animal. And I'll remember that day in the Ozarks and the eyes of that creature as it charged me in the darkness. I don't know if I'll ever encounter it again. Part of me hopes I won't. But another part, the part that's always driven me to push deeper into the unknown, can't help but wonder what other secrets are hiding in the vast networks of caves beneath our feet. One thing's for certain, I'll never look at a cave the same way again. It's not just a geological formation anymore. It's a reminder that there are still mysteries out there, things beyond our understanding, and sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark with just my headlamp, I can feel the weight of those secrets pressing in all around me, because now I know that beneath the surface of our familiar world, in the lightless depths that honeycomb the earth, there are things that defy explanation, things that remind us how little we truly know about the planet we call home. The caves still call to me, their siren song of discovery as strong as ever, but now that call is tinged with something else, a primal fear, yes, but also a burning curiosity. What else is out there, waiting to be found? What other impossible creatures might be dwelling in the depths? As I prepare for my next expedition, checking my gear and poring over maps, I can't help but feel a mix of dread and excitement. Because I know that every time I step into a cave, I'm not just exploring the physical world, but pushing the boundaries of what we think is possible. And who knows, maybe someday, in some deep, dark passage, I'll find the answers to the questions that have haunted me since that day in the Ozarks. Or maybe I'll find something even more inexplicable, even more terrifying. Either way, I'll keep exploring. Because that's what we do as humans. We push into the unknown. We seek out the mysteries, even when those mysteries have teeth and claws and eyes that glow in the dark. Story 23. I used to think the dark was just the absence of light. Now I know it's so much more. It's a living thing, with teeth and claws and eyes that hunger for the unwary. My name is Amy Foster, and I'm an astronomy professor at the University of Colorado. I've spent countless nights under the stars, mapping the heavens and marveling at the vastness of the universe. But it was on a moonless night in the Rocky Mountains that I learned just how little I really knew about the darkness and what it hides. It was late August, and I had decided to take advantage of the new moon to do some stargazing away from the light pollution of Boulder. I chose a remote spot in the national forest, about a 2-hour drive into the mountains. I'd been there before during the day, but never at night. The isolation promised perfect viewing conditions for capturing images of deep sky objects with my telescope. I arrived just before sunset, giving myself plenty of time to set up my equipment while there was still light. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the earthy aroma of late summer in the Rockies. As I worked, I could hear the forest settling in for the night, the last calls of birds, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. As darkness fell, the stars began to appear, one by one at first, then in a dazzling profusion that never failed to take my breath away. The Milky Way arched overhead, a river of light spilling across the black velvet of the sky. I lost myself in the familiar routine of aligning my telescope, checking my camera settings, and beginning to capture long-exposure images of distant nebulae and galaxies. I don't know how long I'd been working when I first noticed something was off. The forest had gone eerily quiet. No chirping of crickets, no hooting of owls, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I paused, my hand hovering over the telescope controls, and listened intently. That's when I saw it, a flash of reflected light in the darkness beyond my small camp. For a moment, I thought it might be the eyes of a deer or elk caught in the red glow of my headlamp. But as I swung my light in that direction, I realized with a jolt that whatever had reflected my light was much too high off the ground to be any normal forest animal. I froze, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. The rational part of my brain tried to dismiss it, a trick of light and shadow, maybe, or my imagination running wild in the isolation, but deep down, I knew this was something else entirely. I scanned the tree line with my light, trying to catch another glimpse of whatever I'd seen. For long moments, there was nothing. Then, just at the edge of my light's reach, I saw them. Two eyes, glowing with an eerie amber light, fixed directly on me. They were easily 7 feet off the ground, and as I watched, transfixed, they blinked, slowly, deliberately, with an intelligence that sent a chill down my spine. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew that would be suicide. Whatever this was, it was big, and almost certainly faster than me in this rugged terrain. My only hope was to make it to my car, parked about 100 yards away at the end of an old logging road. Keeping my movements slow and deliberate, I began to pack up my equipment. My hands shook as I disconnected cables and collapsed tripod legs. All the while, I could feel those eyes on me, watching my every move. I had just finished stowing my telescope in its case when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath my feet. It wasn't quite animal, wasn't quite human, but something in between that raised the hair on the back of my neck. That's when I ran. I abandoned the rest of my gear, clutching only my car keys and the telescope case as I sprinted for the logging road. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind me, branches snapping under its weight. The beam of my headlamp bounced wildly as I ran, casting frantic shadows that seemed to reach for me with grasping fingers. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror drove me forward. I was maybe halfway to the car when my foot caught on a root, sending me sprawling. The telescope case flew from my grasp, clattering across the rocky ground. As I scrambled to my feet, I caught a glimpse of my pursuer in the swinging beam of my headlamp. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with a broad, powerful build covered in dark, matted fur. But it was the face that seared itself into my memory, a nightmarish blend of ape and wolf, with eyes that glowed with an otherworldly intelligence. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we locked gazes. I saw something in those eyes, not just hunger or predatory instinct, but a cold, calculating awareness that was terrifyingly human. Then the spell broke, and I was running again. I could hear it right behind me, its breath hot on my neck. Somehow, I made it to the car, my trembling hands fumbling with the keys. As I wrenched the door open and threw myself inside, I felt something swipe at my back, claws raking across my jacket. I slammed the door and stabbed the key into the ignition, the engine roaring to life. In my rearview mirror, I caught one last glimpse of the creature, silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Then I was speeding down the mountain road, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The drive back to Boulder was a blur. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat. It wasn't until I was safely locked in my apartment, the first light of dawn filtering through the windows, that I allowed myself to break down. In the days that followed, I debated whether to report what I'd seen, but who would believe me? I was known in academic circles as a rigorous scientist, not prone to flights of fancy. If I started talking about monsters in the mountains, I'd be laughed out of every conference and classroom, so I kept it to myself. But the experience haunted me. I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes, that terrible intelligence behind them. I threw myself into research, poring over cryptozoology websites, accounts of strange sightings in the Rockies over the years. I discovered a whole community of people who had experienced similar encounters, who believed that something unknown was living in the vast wilderness areas of North America. Most dismissed these stories as campfire tales or the product of overactive imaginations, but I knew better. I'd seen it with my own eyes, felt the heat of its breath as it chased me through the dark. My experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I still teach, still love the stars, but now, every time I set up my telescope, every time I gaze into the depths of space, there's a part of me that wonders what might be gazing back. I've become more cautious in my observations, more aware of my surroundings, and sometimes, when I'm alone under the night sky and I hear an unexplained sound or see a shadow move in a way it shouldn't, I can almost convince myself that it was all a dream, a product of too many late nights and an overactive imagination. But then I'll catch a whiff of that musky animal scent on the wind, or see a branch moving against the breeze, and I'll remember that night in the mountains, and the eyes of that creature as it pursued me through the darkness. I don't know if I'll ever encounter it again. Part of me hopes I won't, but another part, the scientist in me that's always driven to understand the unknown, can't help but wonder, what was it? Where did it come from? And are there more out there? One thing's for certain, I'll never look at the night the same way again. It's not just a time for stargazing anymore. It's a reminder that there are still mysteries out there, things beyond our understanding. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark with just my telescope, I can feel the weight of those secrets pressing in all around me. Because now I know that in the shadows between the stars, in the vast wilderness we think we've tamed, there are things that defy explanation, things that remind us how little we truly know about the world we inhabit, and how much remains hidden in the dark. The stars still call to me, their ancient light a beacon of discovery. But now, that call is tinged with something else, a primal fear, yes, but also a burning curiosity. What else is out there, waiting to be found? What other impossible creatures might be dwelling in the shadows of our world? As I prepare for my next observation, checking my equipment and studying star charts, I can't help but feel a mix of dread and excitement, because I know that every time I point my telescope at the sky, I'm not just exploring the cosmos, but pushing the boundaries of what we think is possible right here on Earth. And who knows, maybe someday, in some remote corner of the wilderness or in the depths of space, I'll find the answers to the questions that have haunted me since that night in the Rockies. Or maybe I'll find something even more inexplicable, even more terrifying. Either way, I'll keep looking up at the stars and into the shadows they cast. Because that's what we do as scientists, as humans. We push into the unknown, we seek out the mysteries. Even when those mysteries have teeth and claws and eyes that glow in the dark, the night may have changed for me, but it hasn't lost its wonder. If anything, it's only grown more profound. Because now I know that the darkness holds more than just the absence of light. It holds possibilities beyond our wildest imaginations. And somewhere out there, in the vast unknown, something is watching, waiting, perhaps even learning about us, just as we seek to learn about it. And so, I'll continue my work, my eyes ever turned to the skies, but my senses alert to the world around me. For in the dance between light and shadow, between the known and the unknown, lies the true frontier of discovery. And I, for one, am not ready to turn back from that frontier, no matter what terrors or wonders it may hold.